Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Dark Pixel Podcast. My name is Mike.
My name is Landon. I'm Kason.
And I'm Sam, the game professor.
All right, we have the game professor from Games as Literature with us today. Really glad you could join us. Awesome channel. We'll talk about your channel here in just a second, but let's go over the topics real quick, just so that everyone knows what we'll be going over today. So, first of all, there was an article I found that was talking, I guess there was an interview with Eiji Aonuma, producer of the Legend of Zelda series, where he said he and his team don't really know where Breath of the Wild fits into their timeline.
And that's code for they don't care.
Yeah.
Where Breath of the Wild will fit into the timeline. Doesn't matter, guys.
Well, we'll talk about that a bit
Also
as well.
Question. Why do you care?
Anyways, what's interesting about that article is he explains a little bit about the mindset into like what's important to them as they develop a Zelda game, and how they decide when something gets put into the timeline. So that's one thing. Okay, then we've got Visceral Games, or Visceral Games. I think it's Visceral. Developer of Dead Space, which was part of EA, basically. EA had purchased that company back when they were developing Dead Space. EA has shut that company down. They've closed that studio. A lot of buzz about that going on here today as that was announced. So we'll talk about that a little bit. We'll throw some
anti-buzz.
Okay, then another article I was reading was talking about the Secret of Mana remake, how there are no plans to bring that to the Nintendo Switch right now and why that is. So we'll talk about that a bit.
Yeah.
Then we've got some great topics from the viewers today. Really interesting topics. Tom W. asks, are you able to think of one or more games that you'd liken to the greats of literature that will stand the test of time for potentially hundreds of years? Something that could have a real and lasting impact on humanity that is celebrated and played and even studied far into the future. If nothing like that exists, what do you think that is? Or why do you think that is? And how do you and do you think it can be? Sorry, stumbling a little bit there. That's Tom W. Anders Bod Mai asks, I feel that dialogue in games is still hopelessly behind dialogue in movies, and somehow we have to just accept that to be the case. Or we have just accepted that to be the case. We don't criticize bad dialogue in games the same way that we would a movie. Do you agree with that statement? And do you agree with the fact that choices in games are often included at the expense of good dialogue? Okay. Chocolate Rob asks, the use of Amnesia as a narrative device... well, that's just kind of a statement of the topic. Nearly all the Final Fantasy games use it, though each uses it in a different way. It is a very commonly used trope in video games. Is it lazy writing, and can it be used well? And then Rob also has the last one. Basically, that is just asking us what we think about how to effectively incorporate extra lore and backstory and world building into a game. He goes over a couple of examples where they use data logs or outside material like the Ultimania guides for Final Fantasy. What do we think is sort of the best way to approach that? Okay, so before we jump into this, I wanted to give Sam just a moment to introduce his channel, Games as Literature, what it is that you do, why you do it, what motivates you to talk about the things that you talk about on the channel. What can people look forward to as they come in and check your channel out?
No, those are a lot of topics. All right, well, yeah, my name is Sam Gronseth, and my channel is Games as Literature on YouTube. I call the show Games as Lit 101. I actually got the idea because I taught a literature class about video games just for a couple years at some charter schools around where I grew up. It was a senior project of mine when I got my degree in English, and I kind of adapted it to a high school curriculum so that I could teach that. And it was a very interesting and fulfilling experience, but eventually we had to move away, and since I hadn't realized that I would love teaching when I went through college, I didn't have the credentials necessary to make it into a career, so that was kind of the end of that. But I really enjoyed doing it, and so I decided to just kind of adapt some of the same concepts into a web series. So the goal of Games as Lit 101 is just to look at video games from a literary perspective, not as books, but as storytelling, as a medium for telling stories in ways both traditional and unique, specifically like how video games use interactivity to make their stories more powerful or more unique in ways that other mediums can't, stuff like that. So I try and do weekly episodes about one or another topic or looking into one part of a game, and then monthly episodes that are big, long analyses. I just released one for Alan Wake. It's like a 40-minute video about all of its metaphorical elements and stuff. So yeah, that's what that is.
That's awesome. Yeah, I actually discovered your channel on the Prince of Persia video that you posted pretty recently. These guys will attest to the fact that Prince of Persia was like my jam when I was in high school, basically. around that time, that was like I was all about that. And on the channel, I mostly have talked about Final Fantasy, JRPGs, and stuff like that. But I was really, really, really into the Prince of Persia trilogy on the GameCube, PlayStation 2, and Xbox era right there. And so, guys, check out his channel. It's really, really great stuff. I really, really enjoyed it, and I totally recommend it. It's really awesome. In the same vein as some of the stuff that we talk about here, too, so I think you guys will like it. Okay, so this article that was talking about Eiji Aonuma, I believe I found it on Destructoid, but anyways, I can't pull it up at the moment. I should have kept it open. But essentially, what he admitted and what I think everyone kind of already assumed was that the Zelda development team, they don't have the timeline in mind when they are making a Zelda game. So when asked, where does Breath of the Wild fit in the timeline, he was like, I don't know. We haven't really determined that at this point. More or less what he went into was that, when we're developing the game, it's easier to just work on the ideas that we have and build it and then decide later, okay, where can this fit? He said something about fearing inconsistency if they had decided at the beginning of the process, like we're gonna put the game here, but then some other ideas or development takes a different turn or whatever, and then they have an inconsistent. But being worried about inconsistencies in that timeline is, I mean, I don't know. It's already as inconsistent as it could be.
True.
But anyways, I just thought it was really funny because we've joked about this a lot on the podcast before, but how that. I guess when we were first playing Breath of the Wild, right? Because we received an early copy and we were playing through it. Right. And I remember I was sitting there thinking, oh man, this must come at this point in the timeline or that point. I was sitting there theorizing about it. And now it's just kind of, after reading this, I'm kind of sitting here, I'm going I'm never going to think about that timeline again because they don't even care themselves. They do not care about it. They don't even think about it when they're making the games.
The timeline was really only created anyway because fans were speculating and talking about it. I think it was they released it first in the Hyrule Historia, right? That book that they released, and it just wasn't a concern of theirs until that point. So I can understand why they wouldn't want to try and shoehorn everything into it afterwards.
Yeah, especially for a game as large as Breath of the Wild. I don't know though, I remember at least 2 or 3 different times through the course of that game, without spoiling anything in particular, I was like, okay, this is definitely at this point in the timeline. I was like, it's definitely... But that's the whole thing about it is I don't know, there's so much that's vague or just really not explained about it, is that they could decide almost whenever they want that this goes here, and they could explain it away in some way. But
it's funny because at certain points of Breath of the Wild, you do think it's almost like a weird issue of their own making, where they don't care about the timeline, but their games reference the timeline multiple times in a lot of their games. Especially in Breath of the Wild, there's certain lines that are said that are this comes, after these events or something like that. And that makes people wonder where does this fit in the whole grand scheme of things, but they don't have an answer for that. But they're feeding you this stuff, they're making you wonder where it is in the timeline. That they don't have a timeline. It's kind of I think in some ways it's disappointing, but in other ways I think it's fine because it results in a really good game. regardless of whether it makes sense or not.
Well, what I really actually like about Zelda's approach is it's reminiscent of oral traditions, handed down.
Yeah.
Like when you look at a lot of mythology, they try to become, pretty self-referential, but they're not consistent because they were developed. You look at like Greek mythology and Norse mythology, and a lot of them they're just characteristics. You couldn't even call them flaws. It's just that these are stories that were, developed at different areas, at different points in time, and shared and changed differently. So I like to think of all of Zelda as they're roughly telling you the same story again.
Yeah,
This is another oral tradition. And sometimes, people will reference other oral traditions, kind of. And so that's always the way I've liked to look at it, not as anything so concrete as an actual history.
Right, what actually happened. Well, that's not important what actually happened, but this is what they say has happened.
Yeah,
but I remember when I played Ocarina of Time, and I made that like crazy realization that, oh my gosh, the future is the dark world, and the past is the light world, and instead of 7 maidens, you have 7 sages, and instead of the first 3 medallions, you have 3 other things you need to collect. Maybe there's still medallions in Link to the Past, and then there's the Master Sword. Like, it's
the pendants for the sword.
The pendants, yeah. Anyways, it's like it's almost the exact same story, but I think of them as drastically different games, like Link to the Past to Ocarina of Time. But when you look at it broadly and look at an overview, it's like, wait, this is even the elements. Like, I know you got to save Princess from Ganon, whatever, but like obviously it's the same in that regard. But even the elements of the game that fit in within the dark world, light world, and the number of things you have to do. They're the same, so it's almost as if
recurring
some
themes
branch,
of numbers and
it's like these people tell the story this way with a mirror and maidens, but then these people tell the story with like an ocarina or an ocarina. My apologies to all of you great people who think English is full of rules that is actually followed. Anyways, and maidens instead of sages, but it's like it's really kind of cool. It's
there always have
especially when you go through like tribes and things like that.
Yeah, and there have always been just like a couple exceptions to that. Like Link's Awakening is obviously just kind of its own thing. And there have been times like I remember when Twilight Princess was coming out, they specifically said this takes place 300 years after Ocarina of Time. So like there are times that they have specified that, but also plenty of times when they haven't, and they've just let it be its thing. And Breath of the Wild seems to have some very sly references to Ocarina specifically, but like overall it just kind of lets its history be mysterious, and you're not sure, they all interconnect in such weird ways anyway.
That.
Yeah, I actually really liked that idea that you brought up, Landon, about like I think each game they could start out with like some tribe or group of people or a village like around a campfire, like about to recount the oral tradition of the hero or whatever. And it's like each game begins with like a different place and time in that world where they're basically retelling the same story, but in like a different way. And like it would work. I think that's actually a really cool way to look at it, that it's like more or less the same story, just told by different people. And I think that would be, I don't know, like if they had just left the timeline out of it altogether, and it just, because that's kind of the way I looked at it before. I was like, this is just a different telling of like a similar story, not like this is.
It's not like a new
story. Person with the same name 100 years later in the same exact circumstance with a girl with the same name.
It's clearly the same story, just a different version. But it's funny when it's like, oh, this Link is the great grandfather of that Link, and it's it just gets weird. I don't like that.
I'd always figured that it was either that it was like the same legend being told over and over again, or perhaps as a way to explain some of the more out there ones, that it could have been that like the world of Hyrule has like this cyclical thing going on where there is always a Zelda, always a kind of like Bioshock Infinite.
What the timeline, that's what the timeline implies.
Right, yeah. Which can make sense, but when you try and shoehorn it in, especially when most of them weren't made to do that, it gets complicated. So I kind of understand the decision to just say, screw that, we're just making another good Zelda game.
I feel like this kind of summarizes Nintendo's attitude towards stories as a whole.
Yeah. They're
Because
secondary. They're
they
very
are
much secondary.
absolutely secondary to the game itself, and so it's like it's mostly afterthought, or it's just enough to give the structure for the gameplay to make sense, right? And so there's probably some exceptions where, like, the Metroid games have tried to continue with somewhat more of an actual continuum of events.
Yeah, like a linear storyline of some kind.
Like the Mario games, and a lot of it, it's obviously not their focus at all.
Yeah, there are occasional, like some of the Mario RPGs have had a little more of an emphasis on that, and occasional Zelda games too, like Majora's Mask and definitely like Twilight Princess. But
even
not a thing.
Do that, even when they do have those really cool like story moments and things, they're still secondary. You can still make a good story surrounding your awesome gameplay and your super cool world and your puzzles and dungeons, but that all had to come first for the game to be as good as it is. And then, because if you have the story first, then you're trying to fit things in places where maybe they don't quite fit.
It's just a philosophy. It's a company-wide philosophy that I think comes through and stuff like this.
Yeah.
It's not like it's the right way per se, but it's obviously a way to do things. And it's kind of like focusing on doing one thing really well and not trying to be all things for all people. And there's something to be said for that.
Totally. Nintendo does a good job with that.
It's Miyamoto's way. It's Miyamoto's.
Yeah,
indeed.
He has said as much.
My Odyssey is like, good. So
Mario Odyssey is going to be one of the most well-told stories in history. It's going to be something that stands the test of time as far as question 4 goes, right?
Where's the Mario time? That's what I want.
Mario Odyssey.
There you go.
Yeah. And where does Mario Party 6 lie? Because actually, 6 comes before 7. No, 6 comes after 7.
Oh no.
That's just my opinion, guys. I'm just theorizing.
All right. Well, let us know in the comments what you guys think about the Zelda timeline. And if you have any great theories about where you think Breath in the Wild should fit. I'm at the point of not caring anymore, but if you can come up with something interesting, I'd love to hear it. Okay, let's move on to topic number 2. This one's a little more serious. EA. We just learned today that EA has shut down Visceral Games. Visceral Games, known for, of course, Dead Space, the Dead Space games. Dead Space 1 is actually one of my favorite games of all time.
Right.
Well, not like a top 10.
So surprising. They're well done games, right?
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
And you take Dead Space 1 and the type of game it was, and then watch how it slowly sort of turned into just like a straight action game and sort of like lost its original identity over time. And I think you can see
is that when EA bought them?
the influence of Electronic Arts, because the big thing was that Electronic Arts had this insane, kind of like Square Enix, like we've talked about in the past, like these projections for sales for what is a niche genre. I mean, horror is not something that's like widely played or seen. It, the film It that just came out, like broke all kinds of records. It was like the first horror movie
for
an R-rated horror movie that just like blow up like that and go crazy. People don't tend to enjoy feeling fear. So it's a niche audience that's into that sort of thing. Not that you can't have pretty, fairly large success, and Dead Space did. That's the craziest thing about it, is that considering all of that, like, it still sold pretty darn well, but not nearly to the projections that Electronic Arts had, which was, I think, like 5 million units for Dead Space 2 or something like that, or 3. I can't remember which one.
And then ultimately, the reasons they gave for this one have little to do with Dead Space specifically. And like
That's
that
true.
was, I guess this is kind of an unpopular opinion in this scenario, but my first reaction wasn't that strong because I honestly did not like the Dead Space games very much. I enjoyed them very much as action games, like that the mechanics were very fluid, but every time Dead Space 1 tried to scare me, I just groaned, and it didn't work. and I'm a wimp,
Yeah.
so I don't know. I just So like at first I wasn't super sad about it, aside from of course like people losing jobs and stuff. That always sucks. But finding out that like the reason they were doing it is because the Star Wars game Visceral was working on was like a linear story-based Star Wars game, and they basically just decided through focus groups and sales projections and stuff that that wasn't what people wanted. So they're like reworking it all and moving Visceral, spreading them out all over into like we already know that EA is evil and does this a lot. Like they buy up companies and then destroy them.
And they kill so many companies, so many. I don't know.
Hire new employees and then fire.
But like Jim Sterling was showing in his video, he did a video on this today as well. But he was just going down this list of developers, and I remember looking at it, like Westwood, they freaking developed. Oh shoot, I just lost it. The Command and Conquer, Red Alert.
Westwood, that's what we were talking about.
Yeah, like Westwood, and it's like, oh, that developer, like what? Like all these great developers who made awesome games that I've played in the past that EA acquired. And now that company no longer exists. Mm-hmm. And you know, with BioWare, you know, the rough patch they went through with the latest Mass Effect game, you start to wonder, will BioWare suffer the same fate? That would be horrible. But it seems to be what EA is so good at, and that's the part that's really upsetting about this, is that Visceral, in my opinion, was a very good developer. They have a lot of talent there, and they were working on a game with this Star Wars game here. It was a linear, like you were saying, story heavy or narrative heavy game, which I think they're very good at. I think that fits like what the skills of this developer are, and they just decided, no, this isn't really the kind of game that people are going to enjoy. Scratch it. Kill the studio, move people around. It's just like, oh man, it's just really too bad.
It's such a weird thing to like. I get that there are a lot of trends towards open world and you know, like online replayability and stuff like that, but like there are still good linear games coming out that are doing really well. Like no one's going to argue that Uncharted 4 did really well. Wolfenstein's coming out soon. That's not a big open world extravaganza. It's just a linear shooter game. Like it's not as, you know, big and popular, but they do still do perfectly well. And with a Star Wars name behind it, I don't see any reason why this game wouldn't have.
Oh, absolutely.
I know not every Star Wars game has to be Battlefront, you know, again and again and again and again, right?
So.
Yeah. And I mean, one of my favorite games, the reason that I was watching your channel is Prince of Persia, which was a very much a linear, like, narrative-focused game. Yeah.
For that matter, when they rebooted it and tried more of an open-world structure,
right? It just turned into Assassin's Creed, right? So, like, now we've got Assassin's Creed in the place of something that I loved, and you know, there are Assassin's Creed games I've enjoyed. For the most part, I've kind of moved on from that franchise for reasons that a lot of other people had. But that's its own thing, but like that's not the same kind of game that Prince of Persia was. So like this kind of game that I really loved is like not really there anymore. It just sort of like disappeared in favor of all of these, you know, more open world structure kind of games that all these big developers are moving toward. And I don't know, like I think it's a shame that none of them see the value of a linear story focused game. And that they're all sort of moving in the same direction and competing in the same realm. And it's like, we're still here. There are still people out here who want something more like Prince of Persia or something more like...
There's got to be like a rule about the magnetism of Skyrim or something. Like over time, all games will just move to be closer and closer to what Skyrim is.
Yeah.
Like, for one reason or another, it just...
For good and for ill, Skyrim has completely changed to the AAA.
Well, there's always like every decade or so, there's always like one game that everyone just goes all in on and decides, oh, every game from now on is going to be this game again and again and again. And we're still on that Skyrim trend, but who knows? Something
better
else.
that than Call of Duty, I guess. But like, I look forward to diversifying again.
Sure.
Well, Call of Duty was kind of the pinnacle of the Halo replicas, right?
That's true, yeah.
And that's kind of you know, I mean, I don't want to say it's on its way out because they're still massively popular.
Halo doesn't sell nearly what they used to.
But Skyrim is clearly where everyone's going now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyways, let us know what you guys think about that in the comments. Any Dead Space fans out there? Sam's not the biggest fan. I loved Dead Space 1. Dead Space 2 was fine. Dead Space 3, not.
I do agree they got worse over time for sure.
But I just think it's really too bad because I think there's a lot of talented guys at Visceral Games. So feel bad for them. And hopefully they can find work again soon. All right. Third topic here before we move into the viewer-suggested topics. So a lot of people were hoping. It's actually, I'm seeing this quite a lot, and it's cool, but like it's not something that I expected after the launch of the Switch. But it seems like there's just this call for developers to port games to the Switch, games to the Switch. Please bring everything to the Switch. It's like almost any game that's announced, it's like, is that coming to the Switch? It's like in the comments like crazy. So that's awesome, first of all, that people are embracing the Switch. I myself, I repurchased I Am Setsuna for the Switch because I had it on Steam, but I got it on the Switch because I just love being able to just like as I'm going to bed at night, just pull that out and just relax and sit there and play the game on the Switch. So I'm kind of in that crowd too. I really, really like it when games can come to the Switch. And if Secret of Mana was coming to the Switch, I definitely would get it on the Switch. That would be the version that I would want to get.
Yep.
So a lot of people are calling for this. A lot of people are like, hey, like, is that coming to the Switch? It seems like the exactly the right kind of game to come to the Switch, especially considering the fact that in Japan, they have the trilogy, the Mana trilogy, sort of like bundled into one game, which is Legend of Mana, Secret of Mana, and Seiken Densetsu 3, which was never translated for Western audiences, all in one. Now, that's the game I really want, way more than the Secret of Mana remake, but it seemed like a right fit for it. But there's this article that came out today. I was reading over it, and let me read the quote from let's see who it was. Producer Masaru Uyamada. I've never heard of this person. He must be newer to the Square Enix family. Anyways, he says development for the title began before the Switch was announced, so it was definitely beyond our expectations to see the level of anticipation for the release on the platform grow this much. So
that probably means it will come to the Switch.
Maybe.
Yeah, I mean,
nice.
They're aware that people really want it on the Switch. He says they are unable to immediately state that it will become available on the Switch, and that he's fine with continuing to listen to the various requests from our fans to make it happen. So, it seems like, I mean, there have been other times in the past where Square Enix people have said like they love the idea of the Switch, they really want to support the Switch. So it's not surprising if they're going to announce this port down the line or something like that. But I would assume that they're probably going to wait to see how it sells initially on PS4 and Vita, and that begs the question: if you really want to see it on the Switch, do you support that version so that it sells well, so that you can then get the Switch version later? Or do you just wait it out? So, I don't know. What do you guys think?
That's a good question. I mean, I personally, I bought Stardew Valley just this, a week or two ago. I waited for it to come out on the Switch. I didn't buy it for the PC. And so, I don't know. There's a lot of games that if I know it's coming out on both, I would be willing to wait on the Switch end.
Yeah, I think.
How about? Go ahead.
No, just that. As soon as I got the Switch, I knew that that's what I'd be doing. If there's a big technological difference or something, then I'd get it on my PS4 or my PC or something. But the ability to take it with me wherever I want is really helpful to me to have time to play. So for something like Secret of Mana, that's not going to be it's not a big, complex enough game to be significantly more technologically improved on a console or something. So, yeah, I'd absolutely want it on the Switch. The thing in my mind is that they're either going to want to do a virtual console release of some kind or release the remake on the Switch. One way or another, they're going to want that game on the Switch, and I think they're probably going to go for the remake before they put the original game up.
Yeah.
So
I would think that's probably
what's
true
funny?
as well.
With my Switch, and this is funny that people are calling for the Secret of Mana remake to go on the Switch, and everyone would totally buy it and play it if it was just available on the Switch. For the past like month or so, the only games I've actually played on the Nintendo Switch have been old looking games, like old art styles. Like I played Golf Story, I played Stardew Valley, and I played like Project Octopath Traveler, the demo when that first came out. And it's like, and for some reason, you got the Switch, you got this brand new console, and I'm sitting here playing these old-looking games on this brand new console, and The Secret of Mana is being re-released, remade, and I want that for the Switch. Like, you get this expensive piece of hardware, and you're just playing these old games on it. I think that there's something to be said about that, but people are willing to shell out a lot of money to play stuff like that on the Switch. So the companies are going to listen.
Well, along those lines, I find it really fascinating that they're bringing Doom and Wolfenstein, the new Wolfenstein, to the Switch.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to see, like, the visual discrepancy there. They have said already it's going to be locked at 30 frames per second, which I think is to be expected. Yeah. But I'm really curious to see, like, how big of a difference the PS4 version of Wolfenstein versus the Switch version of Wolfenstein is going to look. But
I've been hearing very positive things, like just, on impressions articles and stuff like that. And if they can actually manage to get basically the same experience onto the Switch, that will be impressive, and I think it'll be a big boon for the system, too.
Oh, absolutely. Now, along those lines, Doom and Wolfenstein, like you were saying earlier, are more in the line of the linear sort of like direction in terms of game design and stuff like that. So maybe those are a little bit easier to get them up to a level that's comparable. But, like we've been talking about in the past with Final Fantasy 15, a potential or possible Switch version of that, whether that's going to be that mobile version they're making or whether they're going to actually try and get like the original version of Final Fantasy 15 working on the Switch in a more open world environment. That's definitely a totally different question. But in regards to getting back to Secret of Mana, though, I mean, there isn't any reason I can think of why they wouldn't be able to just bring that over the same exact experience to the Switch. Yeah. And understanding their love for the system already, I would think it's... They said they're not available immediately to state that it will be available, but I wonder if they have, in any capacity, already begun production on a Switch version.
I guarantee they've at least tested it, but as far as production, I mean, we just got to wait until they tell us. Hopefully sometime next year.
Yeah, because this game's release date is early next year, isn't it? Like January or something? February, maybe?
I can't remember.
Yeah.
When is... Secret.
By the way, while Mike looks this up, I have to apologize, guys. Our audio is cutting in and out for me and Landon. So if things get a little weird, I apologize. It's my internet connection. It's just really bad. So we're going to look to fix that in the future.
February 15th. So yeah, early in the year next year. But
that's around when Lost Odyssey or Lost Sphere. Lost Sphere comes out.
Lost Sphere. And that's why I actually really sort of jumped onto I Am Setsuna the last couple weeks because I really want to beat that before.
Wait, I'm sorry. I just heard Lost Odyssey reference and I'm not sure what is being talked about.
Oh, sorry. Lost Sphere. Lost Sphere.
Oh, okay.
So it's
I thought I heard someone say Lost Odyssey, and if there was more news about that,
that would be cool.
I would love that.
I Am Setsuna, a Tokyo RPG Factory game.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah, it's the next game that they're developing. Any case, I really hope that Secret of Mana comes to the Switch, though. But what I hope more for, and I just... Honestly, if they would announce that other version, the freaking re-releases of the original game, the trilogies on the Switch, I wouldn't even buy the new one. I would just get that.
Here's the thing, though. That new one, I mean, it's a remake, but what's it going to be, like 30 or probably 40, maybe $50? It's going to be a full game. And then if you're going to buy that and the trilogy for Seiken Densetsu and all that, like, you're that's $100. I mean, that's a lot of money. If you're probably either just gonna buy one or the other.
Yeah, I don't know, and they probably are knowledgeable of this, which is
it's weird that they did this though at the same time. They remade a game that they have repackaged, and they're selling them both almost at the same time.
Yeah,
I don't know who thought that was a good idea.
It was kind of a similar situation to where they released Xenoblade Chronicles on the 3DS, but you had to have
Yeah.
the new 3DS to play it.
Oh
With
yeah.
the hardware boost. But around the same time, I think that it had become available for the Wii U eShop in Europe or something like that. But they did not make it available in America for a long time
Yeah.
because I think they really wanted to push the 3DS version. But it's like, you got to get a whole new 3DS in order to even play it.
That's what they wanted.
And that's like, what is it? That and 2 other games that require the new 3DS to play. Like that just
Yeah,
didn't really
it's
pan out.
almost
too well.
nothing. Almost nothing.
Fire
Totally
Emblem
irrelevant.
Warriors.
Fire Emblem.
Fire Emblem Warriors were
Oh.
required.
Oh yeah, and then the Zelda game,
The
Hyrule Warriors?
required.
Yeah.
Hyrule Warriors. But I think that you could play that on the other, but it was like ran like crap or something like
Yeah,
that.
well, there are a few that are enhanced, like the 3D Zelda remakes on the 3DS use that little second nub thing.
Yes,
but-
which I loved. I
Yeah,
loved it.
it's not a stick. I don't know what to call it.
No,
It totally is what it is.
It's an eraser.
I actually really liked that thing, except for when I was playing Metal Gear Solid 3, the 3DS version of Metal Gear Solid 3, and I was using it to aim, and that thing was not good for that. I had a 3DS before that, and I had bought the little extension with the slider, like the second slider, and when I had played the game on that, it was way better. But when I tried to aim, there's I forget the name of the boss, but it's the one that's in the jungle, and he's up in
Like
the
the-
trees.
Yeah. Why am I forgetting his name now too? Yeah, the sniper guy.
The sniper
The
guy,
end.
right? Yes, he's up in the trees shooting at you, and I'm trying to because he's hard to see. Like you find where he's at, you got to like quick draw and like shoot at him or whatever, and like using that nub to try and aim, my fingers were getting sweaty and just like slipping off them. Not good for shooters, but
Did they
good
take out
for
the
Zelda
option to
games.
just like wait for 3 days or something? There's something
That's
where in the
true.
original where like you can save the game, turn it off.
Oh, that's
wait 3
true, and
days,
they just
turn it
wait
back
for
on
him
if
to
he died of
die.
old age or something.
It's freaking awesome because he's super old. Yeah.
The Monster Hunter community actually oftentimes mods the nub to be not like a PS Vita style kind of stick. Actually, more like a PSP kind of stick. But there's a pretty easy way to do that, and a lot of people that play Monster Hunter on the 3DS a lot have actually done that, swapped it out. It's a lot easier to use it that way.
Oh wow, that's awesome.
Because it doesn't require any drastic change in the tech. You can have a better slider, but so they could have got an eraser, and they must.
I should
It's like
look
they
into
ordered
that.
too many erasers at Nintendo HQ. And they're
like, what do we do? Put
I
it
should
in
totally
the
look into
3DS.
that. But anyways, Secret of Mana. Will you wait for the Switch version, or will you buy it on PlayStation 4 or PlayStation Vita? Okay. Now we got some of your topics, and this is where we're going to get Sam's expertise here, especially on the first one.
Yay.
Tom W. asks, are you able to think of one or more games that you'd liken to the greats of literature that will stand the test of time for potentially hundreds of years? Something that could have a real and lasting impact on humanity that is celebrated and played and even studied far into the future. If nothing like that exists, why do you think that is, and do you think it can be? What do you think, Sam?
It's such an interesting, this question is kind of part of a whole other lexicon of questions about like how video games will have an impact in the future as an art form and a cultural thing.
Yeah.
I don't force probably. I think is not a good word for that. But I've been thinking about this one a lot, and I think that right now, at least, because the video games are still kind of, I don't want to say they're still immature or whatever. In a lot of ways, we're still working on that, but like we are definitely still learning how they work as a medium and coming to terms with how to best utilize the unique aspects of video games to communicate experiences and tell stories in interesting ways. But so I think that for now, there's something of a distinction to be made between games that will be studied by game creators and game enthusiasts and stuff for years and years and still played and studied, hundreds of years from now, and games that will have that same relevance on culture as a whole. Because there are absolutely lots of very formative games for video games as a medium that will be studied for a long time by people who are studying video games, but there's a degree to which video games don't have the didn't in the past and still really at this point still don't have this particular kind of cultural significance and staying power in general. So that a game like, we can take a Call of Duty Modern Warfare as an easy example of something that had a huge impact on the video game industry, and someone studying video game history and development will probably still be looking at that for a long time. But I don't think that hundreds of years from now we're going to be looking back and saying like, oh, Call of Duty 4 is a classic of all-time video games necessarily. So there's this weird distinction, I think, where I mean, personally, I do think that there are some games that I guess personally have had more of an impact on me than any other, like a movie or a book. Something like BioShock or Spec Ops: The Line, or man, Persona 4. I don't even fully understand the effect that game had on me. Like it became incredibly meaningful to me. But those games don't have the same kind of cultural spotlight on them that movies or books do. So they might have a big impact on me and might have a big impact on the video game industry, but I don't think they'd have a big impact on culture in the same way that a book like 1984 or Uncle Tom's Cabin or something did, simply because video games aren't there yet in the cultural spotlight. So I think there will, of course, be a lot of video games that are studied as part of video game studies, but I'm not sure yet if we have found any of the ones that will have a big impact on culture. I am kind of hoping that eventually we have a Shakespeare happen or something, that someone's going to look way in the past and be like, oh, hey, this video game is really good. And, it becomes a big thing way in the future. But I'm not really sure at this point, aside from some of the stuff that really affects cultural iconography like Mario and Pac-Man, I'm not really sure what some of this stuff would be right now.
Yeah,
that's my thinking too.
I was going to say, I'm glad you brought up Shakespeare, because that's something that in the middle of it actually occurring, you wouldn't be able to point to and say, people are still going to be doing these plays hundreds of years
later.
They
did not know that. A lot of it was satire for the time. Who'd have thought?
Mm-hmm. Exactly, and a lot of it's honestly kind of lowbrow.
Yeah.
Uh-oh. Did we lose him?
I think we might have.
Did we lose him entirely? No. No. Come back.
Sorry, guys. About every 7 minutes.
Yeah.
Clockwork. We're cutting out.
Yeah.
Sorry.
We can't hear you guys about every 7 minutes. So.
Okay. You're back.
Say, though, sometimes things that that were lowbrow for their time, once they're old enough, they come across as highbrow.
They become highbrow. Yeah.
It just seems that way to us, and so there could easily be something we're overlooking. I mean, I would be surprised if that was actually the case. Like you're saying, it's a very new art form. But when we're talking about video games, it's interesting to think we've already seen games last millennia in some cases. Like we've seen, we've got games that you can go and play that are essentially in the same form that people were playing them many, many centuries back. Chess and Go, shogi, stuff like that.
Mahjong.
Right, yeah. And there's even some card games that really, really go back. But I mean, none of those are stories in and of themselves, and I think that this seems to be getting a little bit more of an impact in terms of like what literature's had, right?
Right, Mark Twain, Charles Dickens, like
Like chess has undoubtedly had an impact on culture, but not the same way necessarily that people think of great stories and things like that. So
and of course, some classic stories. Sorry, what?
No, go for it.
Just that some classic stories also have had like an immeasurable, when we think about something like the Odyssey or the Bible, like there are a lot of books that have had an impact on the development of humankind in a way that I highly doubt any other works we create are ever going to, just because like they were so formative in early years of humanity.
We'll never be there,
Yeah. So, I mean, something on that level, probably not. Something on the level of, some other, like Jane Austen or something, which I guess is probably not that great an example because we haven't had many video games on similar subjects, but relatively recent classics, I'm sure. I think there might also be a chance that some indie games might, if only because it's entirely possible that this early era of video games will be remembered in the future as the time that all video games were about shooting dudes, and then these ones weren't.
Yeah, dude, history is not going to look at us kindly in the future when they talk about our era of video games and the games we grew up playing. Like, in the future, people are going to talk about what we did, and our great-great-grandchildren will be pretty horrified that my great-grandpa used to oh, he used to be a racist or whatever. Oh, he used to shoot people in video games. I can't imagine doing that, and that's gonna happen.
You think about a future with like sentient AI and anything, crazy like that. Imagine how you would look back on what we're doing now with AI and video games.
Yeah, and I think that those kinds of fun action movie style video games are always going to be around, but they will definitely be considered like the kind of lesser, I guess, to an extent, in a similar way that like action movies now, we have a lot of action movies that are considered like really good art, but by and large they're popcorn flicks,
Mm-hmm.
And now that's most of what we have in video games, and I think someday that's gonna I hope someday that's gonna change.
Actually, you don't see any action movies winning best film or anything like that, winning the Oscars.
And in all fairness, that's also partially because of Oscars bias. Some action movies have probably deserved that, but by and large, not so much.
I know. You see when actors are gunning for an award, they'll take certain types of roles.
Leo DiCaprio.
And the Tropic Thunder did a great job of fun of that. The whole idea of like only certain things will win awards because there's this idea of what should win an award, right?
Yeah.
Like
I don't know.
genetic.
It's
he should have won.
So there's a part of me that wishes so much that my future children and grandchildren will be able to look back on a game like Chrono Trigger or Final Fantasy VI and appreciate the underlying art of it, right? But there's also part of me that initially sort of thinks that won't happen at all. And I think when framing the question this way, where we're comparing, I mean, maybe Tom W. can correct me if I'm wrong, but comparing the literary aspects of the games that we've had up to this point to some of the greatest pieces of literature ever written, that you're not going to find anything that is comparable in the realm of video games. But I also think that doesn't mean that that a game can't be remembered as a classic in the same sort of way, because video games are not novels. They aren't they aren't literature necessarily. That's not what they're going for. I think that a game like Super Mario Brothers, the NES Super Mario Brothers, could be remembered as a classic of the same kind of caliber in its medium.
Yeah.
When not being compared with its literary or thematic aspects to another medium that's much better for that kind of art. And so I could see certain games that everybody knows about that did have that sort of sweeping pop culture influence. Games like Super Mario Brothers on the NES. I'm trying to think of others that have had this
Tetris.
Pac-Man and Tetris. I'm
Tetris,
I'm trying to think of like more like contemporary or like modern examples of something that swept people like that. I don't want to.
That's the thing. It's not the same.
It's harder
like
now.
we talked before about like Skyrim and how that was
Skyrim,
that was massive.
maybe.
Everyone's doing that now, but it's like that's nowhere near the level that Mario or Pac-Man were when they were at their peak. Like
That is really just
we're
some of the
talking-
older ones.
And maybe that's because they haven't had time to, or whatever. It's like,
Right.
Mario Brothers has had 30, how many years now? Almost 40?
I
Getting
think
up
that's
there?
one way.
Right.
That's one way to look at it. But to be honest, what the industry was at that point in time, for example, with Super Mario Brothers, it was basically dead. The video game industry was almost not even a thing to talk about.
That's true.
And so, as a ratio or as a percentage of the entire industry and the collective mind share of when you say video game, what do you think about? For the longest time, it was Pac-Man. These things had an impact because they had that opportunity. It was like the timing of Apple becoming what they were, or Microsoft becoming what they were, was because that was the window of opportunity there. And so, I feel like there hasn't been such a void in video games to be filled by something as there has been, from that point in time, because there's just oversaturation To be honest, if people know anything, if your average person on the street knows anything new from video games right now, it's probably Candy Crush. Maybe
Sure,
Angry
sure.
Birds. You know, but to be
That's
fair,
actually a perfect.
Even talking internationally, like
Sure.
everywhere in the world, those are the examples. That's what people are playing now.
Yeah.
on
you
their
pull your average
Yeah.
person that's walking through Times Square aside and say, "Okay, which of these video game characters do you recognize?" I almost guarantee you, Dovahkiin would.
Right.
It's
No,
not,
he's not
it's not
one.
one of them.
Yeah, but it's crazy because the impact of Skyrim's been phenomenal. The sales have been phenomenal.
Right.
But yeah, I don't know. I just feel
Well,
like
but I do
It's almost
wonder
possible
about
It's a whole different scale.
like because that game Skyrim in particular is, I mean they had a
you can create your own
character that they used, but yeah, it's
Right.
more of like he's not. There's no characterization. There's let's say does the
Even
average
the name
person
of the game.
does the average person recognize Master Chief or Cloud from Final Fantasy VII, or those
Right.
might not be the best examples, but there may be
Those are good examples.
other video game characters that people would, in the vast majority, recognize immediately.
Yeah.
Maybe more than
I wouldn't say vast
than-
majority, but yeah, most.
Yeah,
I still don't think they're anywhere near. I mean, in video game circles, yeah. But when we're talking
Right.
just the general population, like when I said go to Times Square, who recognizes Master Chief or Cloud Strife versus who recognizes
If
Mario,
anyone could if
I
your
think
average
it's still a
person
different
could
scale.
name Master Chief, I would be. They might see him and be
Right.
like, "That's that
Right.
guy for the shooter,
Yeah.
video game shooter guy." They might
Right.
know that. Yeah.
There's
but yeah,
there's something to be
like my
said.
grandma knows Mario. I don't think she knows Master Chief.
Yeah. There's something to be said too, I think, for the size and cultural footprint of the industry now versus then. Like before, video games were still kind of new enough that Pac-Man wasn't just a thing that happened within video games. It was a big example of this new weird thing that everyone was hearing about, and same for Mario. Whereas now, Skyrim stands out like really tall in the world of video games, but that world is such a big thing that people outside of it don't notice what stands out just in the world of video games. It has to be
Right.
much bigger than that to have that kind of impact now. So
Yeah.
there is something to be said, I suppose, for kind of the insular nature of the video game industry that is changing,
Yeah.
but slowly and not without a whole lot of really problematic resistance. So it's, I think eventually it's possible that something like this could certainly, like the question asked at the end, do you think it can be? And like, I definitely think it can be, but I think that that the standouts of these first few decades, we're probably not going to know what they are until later, and that eventually once video games have more people, kind of a more general, because like not everyone reads a lot of books, but everyone is taught to value books. Once we get to a point where video games are in a similar spot, or at least like where film is right now, I think that it's going to get more likely that they'll have that same kind of cultural impact and lasting value. So we'll see how it goes for sure.
Yeah, and I think that another point to be made is that a lot of these literary works of art that are revered and studied hundreds of years after the fact, a lot of them weren't seen that way at the time. As kind of we pointed out
Yeah.
before.
Yeah.
People didn't think of them that way then, and it took a long time for it to sort of like develop into that. So
Even
I would
amongst,
say-
like film, like Citizen Kane was not
Yeah.
considered the greatest film of all time in its time.
yeah,
About
Yeah.
10, 20 years later, all of a sudden, when Radio Keith Orphan just like went out of business, and like now all of a sudden people kind of like Vincent Van Gogh's paintings, all of a sudden now
Yeah.
gone. People are like, oh, that was actually kind of good, right? It's kind of funny, but that's a very good point you bring up. So it's weird living in the midst of this to determine what's going to stand out.
Yeah.
But I can't guarantee that Mario and Pac-Man go 200 years in the future if universities are still a thing, which they likely aren't. But maybe Harvard's still around just for the rich people to, But if there is, an American culture class, people will likely play Super Mario Brothers, right?
yeah.
I would say that has had a crazy cultural impact internationally.
Sure.
Yeah.
I agree with
It's
that.
funny you say American because that's Japanese company.
That's true. It's like
global thing,
But they sell more in America than in Japan. And it's clearly marketed towards America. So that's funny
Yeah.
how much our culture has been influenced by.
Even semi more recent example on film is Blade Runner, right? Like Blade Runner was
Mhm.
panned pretty bad when it first came out. Nobody understood it, and is now remembered as one of the great science fiction classics that has completely created an entire subgenre with neo noir and cyberpunk and that sort of thing. So
and dystopian, future.
yeah, so it's really hard to say which video games will be remembered like that. I think the one that almost all people could agree on is Mario and Super Mario Brothers.
Right.
But possibly Sonic I could see as a character that is still widely known.
But
like,
see, we're talking about characters
in the future.
here. That's the tricky thing.
That is true.
It's, characters can outlive their game. Like, for example, when was the last time any of us played Pac-Man? But we're sitting here saying that everyone knows Pac-Man, right?
Yeah, everybody
so
does.
It's tricky to separate a character from like a game. If there's a game,
from the work itself.
right?
Yeah. You know what's funny too, though. To your point earlier, Sam, which you were talking about, where our current generation of games is people killing people, and that's something we got to get over if we really want these people 200 years from now to look positively on our generation. I think that people would go through the classics of Pac-Man and Mario, and then just kind of gloss over what we're doing now, because it's like, and then they just went through this violent phase where the graphics were catching up and everything looked way better. Every 10 years, things took this massive leap forward, but you're still killing people. And until we get to a point where the graphical,
not chasing
they're not chasing graphics anymore, because it's just insane. It's still marginal, the difference between 4K and 8K, and what the consoles are doing. Once we just get past the graphical arms race that the companies are in right now, and they stop focusing on that, and they start just making good games because everything looks pretty real by now. That's around the time where I think we're going to start to see we're going to start to leave behind some of the things that game companies are doing now that I don't like. Even though
it's one of, I think,
I
many...
freaking love violent games.
Yeah. It's one of, I think, many steps that we're kind of going to need to go through in terms of getting past the point, because we've been working towards that for a long time. I think that once video games started, which, I mean, they always kind of were, but once it became a more popular thing to have a stylized look instead of a realistic look, that was kind of part of that process of moving on. Like there was, once a time where Nintendo says, hey, we're going to make a Zelda game that looks like a cartoon, and people freaked out about it. And now, of course, we're at a point where, and now, of course, we're at a point where anywhere from a AAA industry can make a game like Borderlands, or we can have indie developers making things that are stylized, and that is acceptable. And so I think that just needs to leak upwards into the AAA industry, and by that point, maybe we'll be at that point where we're not trying to just chase photorealism anymore. But yeah, I agree that once that element is removed, then there will be more freedom to just do what you think works best. So
what's funny? Even within animated films, like CG animated movies that are way beyond what video games can produce in real time today, right? They may have super realistic environments. They may have crazy realistic atmospheric.
No.
Oh no! Again.
Is it 7 minutes on the dot that it happened? They'll be back. They'll be back. One second. Sorry, everyone watching. We'll get this figured out next week for sure, so that we'll have to deal with the connection issues.
Realism and start.
There they are.
Stylizing. Oh, did we lose you again?
We lost you for about 20 seconds.
Talk about going to a stylized look.
So, did you hear my thoughts about the Uncanny Valley? Did I say that?
I didn't hear that at all, no.
Okay, so you know how video games today and movies today there's a pretty big gap there. So animated films today will often have a very realistic environment, very realistic lightings, atmospherics, and shading, and everything look very good. But when it comes to the characters actually they're very stylized. They're very, here a good example, and this is a kid's movie I know, but How to Train Your Dragon 2 looks freaking real.
Right.
Everything looks real except for the people. And basically every CG animated movie that comes out today is basically like that, because the animators are trying to avoid something known as the uncanny valley. The uncanny valley is where things look superhuman, but not quite close enough. They don't move right. They're still a little different. It makes people feel uncomfortable. And so as games start pursuing this ultra realistic look that is where animation is at today, you have to look at what animators are doing today, and they're not going for that in their characters. So video games need to kind of come to that same conclusion, that same like realization that, hey, we can make everything look good, but when it comes to these people, like it's okay to have a stylized look. And to Mike's point about how when you're living in the era of greatness, you don't know it until afterwards. Wind Waker, I hated Wind Waker when I was a kid. I did not like it. I hated the graphical style. Now, I still played it. I liked it after I finally took the time to beat it. But as we move forward, and as I've played Wind Waker HD Remastered and played it again, it's been almost 15 years now, that is one of the best games I've ever played. But I didn't know it at the time, and people were so mad because of the style. But that ended up being like one of the best moves that Nintendo made. I
think the childhood affects that too. Like Mike mentioned earlier, the idea of hoping that his kids will be able to appreciate games like Chrono Trigger or whatever. And see, that's a difficult thing because those games won't translate very well one-to-one. Kind of like if you sit a kid in front of Casablanca or something, they're going to be bored because, like, where are the colors? Why are these people real instead of CG? You know, like, but
right.
I would like to think that once people that, you know, maybe kids won't be able to appreciate. I already know, like, a lot of people, even, you know, my age, who like can't get into Final Fantasy VII because the graphics look so weird in hindsight. But I would like to think that, generally speaking, like, as people grow older and if they have a serious interest in video games the same way as, you know, film buffs or people who major in literature or whatever do in their mediums, that they'll be able to play through and appreciate games like that.
Yeah.
And for that matter, that maybe at some point we'll get remakes that faithfully bring them to audiences that can't handle the older stuff. Like, I mean, that's hard. In video games, we don't get that often, but, like, that's a thing that's happened in movies. No. There are a lot of movies that are remakes of older movies, and the remakes are the classics. So, like...
You know, that's a good point. Like, I've heard people talking about, like, you mentioned It earlier, Mike. I've heard a pretty wide consensus of opinions saying that the remake is better than the original film.
Yeah.
And the book better than the book because the book is freaking weird.
One thing that I mean, really, really great points all around. One thing I wanted to point out as well is that it kind of goes along with what you were just saying, Sam, is that the fact that these, you know, works of art that are studied, that are discussed among the world's intellectuals, you still can't sit a common person in front of that piece of art, generally speaking, and have them appreciate it on that scale. Like you're saying, you take a modern person and make them watch Casablanca. Most people probably aren't going to understand or appreciate it quite the way that, like, you know, people who are into film, who are into the art of film, not just like your average moviegoer, right? And the same can be said for probably a lot of Shakespeare stuff. Like a lot of kids in school are sort of forced to read Shakespeare because these are classic stories, and you know, he was a brilliant writer. But it's like a lot of them are like, oh, I don't understand it, I don't get it, like this. But they wouldn't do that in their free time. You know what I mean? So even still, even if it's considered a classic work of art, it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody 200 years from now is going to want to play Super Mario Brothers in their free time or something like that. The
classics are boring. That is always reigns true.
I always forget who, some writer, I want to say Charles Dickens, but it might have been someone else entirely, said that a classic is something that everyone wants to have read, but no one wants to read.
Yeah.
And that's like my favorite quote about it ever.
Totally true. Okay. Well, anything else you guys want to add to that, or
no? I think we did a pretty good job on that one.
Yeah, it was thorough.
Covered it as thoroughly as we could. Okay, let's move on to Anders Bod Mai. He asks, I feel that dialogue in games is still hopelessly behind dialogue in movies, and somehow we have just accepted that to be the case. We don't criticize bad dialogue in games the same way we would a movie. Do you agree with that statement? And do you agree with the fact that choices in games are often included at the expense of good dialogue? For the last part there, are choices included at the expense of good dialogue? I mean, I can't answer yes or no for certain in terms of like whether or not that has affected a writer's, what a writer's doing with the story or something like that with dialogue. But I don't feel like those two things are tied together in quite the way you're suggesting. I think they're kind of exclusive to each other. It's like you can say like we're going to have these choices available and still have a well-written piece of dialogue to accompany that choice. Yeah. So I'm not sure how much that affects it.
Well,
but I do think.
Go
ahead.
Or, well, yeah. Well, I'll let you finish. Just that I think that there are games that prove that, and I'll get to that when. Yeah.
Okay. Sure. Yeah. I'd love to actually hear your thoughts on that. So, but I do think in general, yes, that dialogue in video games tends to be bad or at least worse than you see in film. But I think some of that might have to do with the mindset we've talked about earlier, like Miyamoto's mindset, where the focus is really in making the game mechanics fun and enjoyable and in, making the game good. And then story is sort of an afterthought, I think, a lot of the time. But I do still think that there are a number of games that have really strong dialogue. So I don't think that it's hopelessly behind in the sense that it has never reached that level, but I would agree that for the most part, it's not on par. Right. But there are a lot of really terrible movies out there, let's be honest, with really bad dialogue in them, right? So, I mean, like most movies that come out aren't necessarily really great movies, and most games that come out aren't necessarily really great games. I mean, there's, kind of an average there.
Well, that's where you have to take the greats and compare them to the greats, right? You can't take the good games to the bad movies. You've got to take the good games to compare them to the good movies, and that's, I think, where the discrepancy is.
Yeah. And see, that's why, like, I totally get where this question is coming from, especially since for most of, I mean, we've talked about how video games are still kind of growing, and for a lot of time, heck, especially like early in video games, if you wanted a good story in a video game, it was probably going to be made in Japan, which unfortunately meant that like the localization wasn't going to be very, like you go back to Final Fantasy VII, that story touched a lot of people, and for good reason, I'd say, but the dialogue isn't great. And I don't know how it was originally, but, the localization, when you have, like the classic mistakes like this guy are sick, all the way up to just exchanges, like in one of the first emotional moments of that game, there's this exchange between like young Tifa and Cloud that's basically just her saying a thing and then Cloud going, what? Like 5 times? And like... There's this degree to which for a lot of early games, especially Japanese ones, we need to understand that quality of story and storytelling and impact and emotion are kind of separated from quality of dialogue. So like I totally get where this is coming from, but I agree with what was said before that maybe if we took like video games as a whole, there are more video games with worse dialogue than there are movies with bad dialogue or something, but I think that if we're taking the games that, like, I can think of plenty of games that I never thought had an issue with dialogue. So, like, if we're taking the best games and comparing them to the best films, I don't really think there's as much of a discrepancy there.
Yeah.
And I think that the choices thing has been, like, there are plenty of, I mean, maybe there are still mistakes to be made, but, like, I can't think of big complaints about dialogue in some of BioWare's best work or most of Telltale's games, and those are like all about choices. So I don't think that necessarily affects it. I think what's trying to be gotten at in that question is whether the idea of more story precludes quality of writing or something, and I can get that, but I don't know. I think it's not necessarily a conflict.
That's kind of where I was going to go next with it, is that, I mean, the average like narrative-driven video game, especially like an RPG, let's say like The Witcher 3 or something. I mean, just the sheer amount of dialogue in that versus the average 2-hour movie, probably less than 2 hours, hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes or whatever movie, is just like gigantic. So like there's just so much more room for error or to mess something up or for something not to come out right, especially with these crunch times and all these people like just like staying at work for 16 hours a day and on the weekends, and like the fatigue that settles in, and I have a deadline, I have to have all this done. Like the writers are going to not write perfect dialogue more often in an environment like that. and I think that film just for what it is, sort of lends itself for having better consistency in the quality of dialogue throughout an entire movie versus a game. It's like The Witcher 3, for the most part, has excellent dialogue, but there are going to be some instances that people will upload funny videos of little clips of some weird stuff that people say or whatever that doesn't fit. And you're going to find that more in games because games are just way, way, way longer and larger in scope in a game like that. So, I don't know. That's what I would say about that. But
I think some of the criticism too can come from the type of like outlandish stuff we still have going on in a lot of video games, since it's all action focused. Like that, there was a lot of flack for that wizard came from the moon line from the Destiny alpha.
Oh, right.
When like in context, the line makes perfect sense. It's not like necessarily in the context of Destiny like a badly written line. It just sounds so absurd because Destiny's dealing with such absurd things that like, yeah, it was really silly. And I don't know. Like, I think there are still a lot of ways in which we still need to branch out enough in the types of stories we tell in video games to really hone the writing skills in video games. So
that's a good point, because a lot of times you'll just get the same writer. Like, video games are kind of cast into, basically they're all the same genre. It's the video game genre. And somebody who wrote one game will be brought on to write this new game, but these games have nothing to do with each other. The genres are totally different, but it's the same writers because that's the company's writers, and this is the game they're making. It's not like they're hiring somebody who actually is better at writing drama or comedy, or it's the one guy, or not the one guy, but the team, and they're doing it all for every game, and that's just how it is. And it's weird. You got to temper your expectations a little when that happens.
In Hollywood, there's a job called script reader, and script readers read scripts. Really? And what happens in Hollywood is there are so many scripts that people are sending in, so many that they'll go through and go, no, bad, good, bad, good. They'll blow through and make notes, kick them back to whoever's writing. And I don't feel like there is a filter of that sort for the video game industry as much. I don't feel like people sit down and I'm going to write a video game. You know,
right, there's no spec scripts. They're all
exactly.
They're all in-house.
So I feel like there's almost the sheer odds. It's like a numbers game in Hollywood that you're gonna find the script where the guy nailed the dialogue and the themes and whatever, like with a higher likelihood than maybe in the video game industry where you're like, hey, I want, like you're saying, spec scripts versus like the in-house guy doing it. So I think that could come into play a little bit with why maybe movies feel better written than video games. But I think another thing, and this is like super out there, but if you look at when movies started as talkies, right? Like not when they started, but when they started incorporating sound as talkies. Maybe people were acting, and it's like no one knew how to act. They were acting for a stage still. No one knew how to act for a movie. And then, cartoons kind of came around. You had to do voiceover lines and work. And so there's like almost a subgenre of actors that just do that now, right? I was watching a bunch of interviews with Adventure Time voice actors, and it's just like, what else are you working on? Well, I'm voicing this, I'm voicing this, I'm voicing that.
Yeah.
It's become a sub-discipline. And video games draw on that quite a bit, but still not completely. Like, I'm going to avoid saying specifics because I don't want to offend anybody, because that's not my intention here. But Kason and I, the beginning of the year, toured a film set. And it was a science fiction film set, and we got to meet the actors and talking to them in person. I was like, dude, this guy's got some chops. Like I could tell this guy was cast well. And then we got to watch them shoot a scene, and it was like, oof. Like it was not coming together. And it was like 5 or 6 people, and it just wasn't clicking. And they ran through it a few times, and it was just like, dang, each one of these people was so great on their own, but they just weren't. They didn't quite have what it took when like all the pieces connected. The whole wasn't making as much sense. And the reason I mention this is because one of those people does video games.
Yeah, is a prominent voice actress in video games.
Big video games.
Yes.
And it just made me like realize like sometimes I don't know if video games should strictly draw from voice actor talent pools.
Yeah. Oh no!
No, not again. Okay, so he had just left off.
We'll just have his like doomsday clock
shouldn't
at every 7 minutes.
shouldn't draw strictly from voice
No,
acting
we-
pools.
We disconnected for a second. sorry.
Okay, you're back. You had just said they shouldn't draw exclusively from voice actor pools.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know because everyone wants to incorporate mocap now in their video games, and acting along with mocap definitely has benefits. Like sometimes you can tell when they weren't doing that. So I can see why they're wanting to go outside of strictly voice actors. But I don't know if those people necessarily have the presence. So my grand theory with all of this is it's possible that there's not a large enough group of people working in the industry that understand how to act for a video game, if that makes any sense. In the same way that there's been a bit of a learning curve. Not that nobody does, but that on the whole, I don't think we have enough that we're populating a lot of these really dramatic games with all of the exact right kinds of people. That makes sense. And I know that's probably reaching a little bit, but I think there's something there.
Yeah, well, the same could be said for writing in video games. Like, I don't know how much this affects dialogue as opposed to, like, overall story and structure and stuff, but there are many instances of people bringing famous authors or screenwriters onto video games and it not working as well as you'd think. Like, I remember when, I know this has happened a few times with, like, Advent Rising and such, but I remember quite vividly when Call of Duty Ghosts happened, and they were all like, "Oh, we have a guy on who's writing the story, and he won an Academy Award. I think he won. He might have just been nominated, but I think he won an Academy Award for it." So I was like, "Oh man, a good Call of Duty story again. Finally, I'm interested in this. I hope it works." It didn't super, and there's such a there is a big difference in writing, and I think that's a lot of why we often have so many games, especially shooters and military games and such, where the story is kind of like a blur and you don't remember it too well, because so much of what happens is this like, oh, well, this generator's out, go fix it. Well, now that generator's out, there's some bad guys over there, go kill them. And you're kind of doing a lot of menial things that aren't, the story isn't memorable in broad strokes because it doesn't take very many broad strokes. It's a dramatic beginning, a bunch of weird little things that don't matter too much, and then a dramatic ending. And again, I don't know how much that affects dialogue necessarily, but like these kinds of problems exist where we're still trying to figure out how to tell a story in an interactive context, and that affects the writing. And that it's something that we're needing to kind of still get a handle on.
Sure. Along the point that you were making, Landon, about having individuals who were very talented, very good at what they did, but like the whole just wasn't clicking or coming together very well. I think that sort of thing is actually much, much harder to pull off with the way that actors are recorded in video games, because they are almost always by themselves. They do not actually come together, unless it's something like a Naughty Dog game where they have the actors actually doing the mocap and they're all interacting with each other, which is why those games tend to be so good in this aspect. Because it's not, we're talking about writing and dialogue being bad, but sometimes it's just that the delivery of that line didn't work with the delivery of the line that came before it. They didn't feel like they naturally ran together. Whereas when the actors are actually in the same mocap studio speaking to each other, it just flows so much better. But for such a gigantic RPG, which is mostly what we talk about on this channel, where you have thousands of lines of dialogue and hundreds of scenes, you just can't do that. So you have to put the actor in a booth by themselves, feed them a line that hasn't been recorded even by the other actor yet, and they have to try and respond to that in the way that feels naturally to them in that moment. But that's so much harder to pull off. And I've recently done some very, very small time, well, not very small time, but just other YouTube channels. I've done some voice acting, and I've really gained an appreciation for voice actors that can do that. Because like, no disrespect to the directors that I've worked with. Like, I think that the work came out very, very, very good for the limitations that they had and the time crunches and doing everything by themselves and everything. But I remember watching and thinking like, I would not have chosen that particular delivery that I did in that moment. I feel like I had done it better in this take or something like that, And so like you have an actor delivering a line probably a bunch of times thinking, I think I got it with that one. But then the director chooses a different take. And then having that happen between an entire cast of people and then trying to make all of those takes sort of like work together is such a challenge that I think a lot of times it's not even necessarily that the dialogue was poorly written. It's just that these actors aren't even in the same place. They've said the line 10 or 15 times and are possibly fatigued in the particular line that they chose, but they liked it because his inflection went here, which anyways, there's just so many factors that go into that I think can give the, I don't want to say facade, that's not quite right, but at least the illusion that the dialogue is worse than it actually is.
Yeah, I agree. I think you've made some good points there. It's not just the actors, because a director, when we say the word director, we equate it with the film director, right? Yeah. But video game directors are very different. Basically, a film director will have some responsibilities in pre-production and post-production, right, with the casting and editing and so forth. But for the most part, what a director's job is on a film set during production is to work with the actors, right? Mm-hmm. You've got people doing the lighting. You've gone through that all with them already ahead of time. They know what they're doing. Everyone around you knows what they're doing. It's the actors and getting them to do and to say exactly what you want them to do. That is a director's job. They're technically, I think a long time ago, they were just called the acting director, right? So there was lead actor. They're usually the lead actor. Like Charlie Chaplin directed a lot of his own films. But the director of photography, the director of the director of acting. So film directors are so different in that regard from game directors who aren't focused on that. Like, they've got so much going on and they're trying to juggle so many technical things, and they're trying to get like the game flowing in like dialogue, and getting your actors to elicit an emotional response is not the specialty of a video game director the way that it is the specialty of a film director. And so you'll get things like a director who's basically a computer programmer, right? But he's directing this game, and he is, just kind of doing whatever he gets, whatever take the actor's given, that's what he'll use, and he'll just pick the one he likes the most. But he or she, I keep saying he, sorry, will not always be capable of getting those responses. So I like that you bring that up, because it's not just an actor being an actor, and is he a good actor or a bad actor? It's the director, and films or video games are lacking that like talent of directors who are good at directing characters and actors and voice actors, because they're doing so much other stuff that they also have to be good at.
Yeah, there's this awesome video that you guys should look up on YouTube if you haven't seen it before, but it's Lee Unkrich, and he's talking about I think we've mentioned this before, he's talking about the dialogue editing of Toy Story 3. Yes, and Pixar works with the best actors in the world. Yeah, they just do, right? They cast the perfect person, and sometimes people think that the person, like people think Billy Crystal looks like, his character in Monsters Inc., right? That they share, but they were actually modeled separately. It's just that the casting is just so dead on. So Lee Unkrich, he goes through and he shows how they cut up some of Tom Hanks' lines, because he gave them a ton of different deliveries on a certain line in Toy Story 3, of course, for like the whole script, but the one he's showing is this certain line, and some of these deliveries are actually spaced apart by months. At one point, they keep having him come back. And Lee Unkrich says that because he started as an editor and became a director, so he's like a very editing conscious director. And he says that they picked and chose the deliveries that Tom Hanks gave for Woody that sounded emotionally true. And there was no single take where the whole take sounded emotionally true. Right. They were able to cut out the emotionally true sounding parts, piece it together masterfully, where you can't, no one can tell that this is what they're doing when they're watching the movie. That they cut out, like, 7 different takes. So he goes and he plays like a sound each time there was a cut in the dialogue, and they cut to a different take, and there's just like a ton of them. And you just think games do that. No, like Mike was saying, like the sheer volume of what you're working with doesn't allow you to get that granular. And so sometimes what you're seeing in a movie is the product of the fact that the movie's only 2 hours long. Yeah. And video games, if you bought a game and it was a video game that was only 2 hours long, it better be the Stanley Parable, or it better be, you know what I mean? Like, people don't Journey. Yeah. People don't generally work with that. Like Journey, yeah. People usually want 20 hours, 30 out of their games.
Right.
That definitely. On top of that, like dialogue choices, dialogue trees can add to that volume to where you're writing the whole Bible and then recording the whole Bible. So, anyways, I can't remember what the title it was, but Liam Critch's Toy Story 3
Audio
dialogue editing.
Dialogue.
But it's crazy. It's crazy how granular movies get sometimes, and we don't realize it. We take it for granted, I think.
Yeah. There's something to be said, too, for the fact that I think video games are still kind of like multimedia art forms in general just have a lot of things going on. It's not like a book where you have like your writer and your editor and that's basically all you need. Like there's a lot of different stuff going on that has to come together to form a single work of art. And I think that over time with things like film that's been around for a while, we've learned to kind of view it in a more holistic sense where it all kind of comes together and we know how it's all going to function as a whole. With video games, we started off with these. I mean, I remember when video game reviews would usually give like separate scores to graphics and to story and to gameplay and stuff like that. And we're mostly past that now, but we're still working on we're getting past this idea that video games are a bunch of disparate little parts that maybe we'll enjoy when they're put together. And I think that something like this is going to work a bit better when we stop trying to say like, oh well, this one's just about the gameplay, so we'll stick a story in there, but it's about the gameplay, and more focus on like making it all work better as a balanced whole, because I think we're still kind of getting to that point.
Yeah, for sure. I totally agree with that.
One more thought.
Okay.
One more thought, really quick. I want to bring up Kingdom Hearts really quick. So I brought it up in the podcast.
I was going to bring that up for the next question, actually, so this will be fun.
Oh, really? Well, we can just flow right in there then. I'll let you go through that. But Kingdom Hearts got high level voice acting talent, like Hollywood level, like with Haley Joel Osment, Jesse McCartney, but with people like Christopher Lee and Leonard Nimoy, and some really, really big names. And then for a lot of the characters for the Disney portions of the games, they got a lot of the original actors from the actual films, especially the ones that were done in the 80s and 90s, where those people are still around. And the crazy thing is that Kingdom Hearts, while I would not call the voice acting bad, it's not bad. They're good voice actors. It's the editing that is the timing is weird. Like you said, Mike, they're not recording in the same room. They don't sound like they're interacting with each other. They just sound like they're giving lines and reciting something back to each other. And there's awkward pauses. And like Kingdom Hearts, for as high level voice acting talent as they have, it is clear that there are other issues at work in video games than just having good voice actors. It's not about the voice acting. It's video games have other underlying issues that are causing this perception, such as how long they are and all the other things that we've talked about before. They're not recording together and all this stuff. But I just wanted to bring up Kingdom Hearts because those are some of the best voice actors to be brought together into a single game. And I would not say that is the best voice acting I've seen in a video game by far. And then you got Final Fantasy 12, which probably is the best voice acting I've ever heard in a game. And I don't know I didn't recognize a single name when the credits rolled. I don't know who any of those people are. They're not the top Hollywood level people. I don't know that they've done much. I don't know.
Yeah. It's a good example to bring up because something Landon was saying earlier is rather than looking to sort of your immediate voice acting pool of people, they turned to stage and film actors and they went kind of outside of that for that game specifically.
Right.
And they really focused on how dialogue was delivered and it was a lot heavier of a focus for that game than say like another one of the Final Fantasy games or something like that.
Exactly.
So, and once again, with these examples, we're running into localization too, and how that affects both the writing of the dialogue and the delivery. Like with both Kingdom Hearts and Final Fantasy X as well, there are limitations with how they bring the timing of the English translation in with the timing of the Japanese ones. You see it in anime too, where like phrasing will be weird and awkward sometimes, or
that's a pretty good parallel with anime.
Yeah, and ideally, good localization can fix that up pretty well, and that's like you see anime and video games both getting much better at that recently, but it was a problem like that, especially with games like of the PS2 era that were coming over there, that like Final Fantasy X is famous for having terrible voice acting, and some of it yes, like that laughing scene, that's not great material in the first place, hard to pull off, but by and large the voice acting in that game is not that bad, but it sounds so awkward because of those things you were talking about.
Because of all that.
yeah, it gets a lot harder when we're taking it from another language. So there's just a lot of factors.
Yeah.
Just got to throw this out there though. Kingdom Hearts, I actually do think it has good voice acting for a video game. Just throwing that out.
Okay, great discussion, guys. And thank you for the question, Anders Bod Mai. Really good one. Let's move on to Rob's last two questions. Let me know, Sam, if you need to jet. Some of these tend to go about 2 hours long. This is going to be one of them.
No, I'm fine.
Questions,
Yeah, no, I'm doing perfectly all right. If anything, I'm just annoyed because this chair is so squeaky, so I've been needing to like sit completely still the whole time. It's hurting my back a little bit.
Mine makes a lot of noise too. I got to get some WD-40 for it. But,
yeah, seriously. But I have the same problem filming my show because the wooden chair I use on that creaks too. I'm used to it. So.
Okay,
yeah,
Chocolate Rob. The use of Amnesia as a narrative device is the topic. Nearly all the Final Fantasy games use it, though each uses it in a different way. It is a very commonly used trope in video games. Is it lazy writing? Can it be used well? What do you think about that, Sam?
I've got to establish right off the bat that the question to can this thing be done well is almost always yes, it absolutely can. It doesn't. It's not always used well, and some things are overused and stuff, but like when it comes down to it, Kingdom Hearts as an example, if I was in like the boardroom or whatever when someone was like, okay guys, I want to make a video game, it's going to be a crossover with Final Fantasy and Disney, I would have like fired him out. Like that's such a weird idea. But you know, they made it work. And, you know, plenty of other things. Like we have a new My Little Pony show that's got popular because, like, it's not for everyone, but it's legitimately got like good production quality and a good team behind it. So, like, anything can work. And Amnesia is one of those things that I think, it's usually rightly considered lazy writing, but not because it's a bad plot device or a bad thing to have in a story, just because it's been overused. And for that matter, used specifically in a lazy manner, like to make it so that you can easily have an in medias res and have a bunch of big reveals later on. Like, the use of Amnesia in video games has often been a lazy thing, but that doesn't make the use of Amnesia in and of itself a lazy or especially a bad plot device. And I was thinking about this one in terms of like what makes the difference. And I think there are kind of two main things for it. One, the less important, but still I think important one, that there's something kind of unique about it. That there's some, you know, like that the reason behind the amnesia or that something's going on aside from just like, oh, well, something bad happened and now you lost your memory, you know. I think that the use in, I'm sure that some people will disagree here, but I think that the use of it in Final Fantasy VII was fairly interesting. I think Dustin Elysian Tale did an interesting job with it. But there is that, but I think the most important thing is that it should always matter to the story, not just in terms of being an important plot point, but also being important to the character and their arc and the general themes of the story, which again is something that I'll just name drop Dustin Elysian Tale. I did an analysis on that a few months ago, and like the answer to the amnesia had a lot to do with what that character was. Like an amnesia plot is inherently about identity, you know? And if you're going to make the story about identity and about this character kind of rediscovering themselves, which I guess Bayonetta almost kind of did too, but then it works. But if you're just going to make it a reason to reveal a bunch of exciting stuff later, then not so much. And I think that's kind of the most important thing, to make it so that the use of amnesia speaks to what the story is trying to say instead of just making it easier to say it.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I would agree. I don't think amnesia itself is lazy writing. I think what's lazy and why it sometimes seems lazy is withholding information to sustain drama in and of itself is lazy writing. So what I always come to when I think about that is the TV show Lost.
Yep.
To me, that's pretty lazy writing, because you're interested because there's the potential for them to tell you something you want to know. And they tease that. But
for 7 years,
you realize they didn't ever actually have the substance there, right? That's lazy writing, because instead of having something that's genuinely intriguing, you're saying, okay, have something whack or out of the blue happen, and be like, we'll tell you why. You're real close to finding out why, you know? Yeah, and amnesia can fall into that. Like, they can use it in that form, but it's not because amnesia in and of itself is lazy. At least I believe that strictly withholding information to sustain drama in of itself is a lazy approach. I feel like.
Yeah. And I think that can be like, we can look at examples of good amnesia storytelling in video games too, and see like what you're talking about in action. I am hopelessly behind, unfortunately, and haven't finished The Witcher 2 or played The Witcher 3. But like, those games include amnesia, like as a major thing. Geralt doesn't remember his past, and like, I've never heard anyone complain about how it uses amnesia. And then like, I can think of Lost Odyssey and how it used amnesia, like partially as a way to have a big reveal later on, but like, it mostly used it so we could have those beautiful short stories about Kaim's past, like as he, something would trigger something and we'd remember these experiences of what it's like to live an immortal life with everyone else dying around you. And like, that was great. That was a great addition to the game. And because it's not just there to provide a gotcha moment later, like you were talking about. It's there to actually enrich our understanding of the character and kind of bring us along on their rediscovery of themselves.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you brought up Lost Odyssey, because
I love that game so much.
Both of you made really, really good points, and I'm going to try to like weave my way into making the same points but reaching a different place as well, because I wanted to say a lot of the same stuff. Right. But yes, I think the reason why it is seen as lazy, as Landon said, is because it's used to create a mystery. It's used so that you can withhold the information until this moment in time or whatever. And that's like, if it's used so often too for that reason. So that's one thing that I think that bothers people. I'll give examples of how I think that's done well in a minute. So like, for instance, I haven't even really gotten that far into Knights of the Old Republic. But I do remember when I booted the game up and started playing, it was like you wake up out of the bed and it's like, how do you not know what ship you're on or who the captain is, and blah, blah. And it's just like, oh my goodness, that dialogue's terrible. And like, it's such like a bad example of how to use amnesia. It's like the cliche version of it, right? That's just like, you don't know anything about this world because I'm the player and I don't know anything about this world, and this person needs to explain these very basic things to me. Yeah, it's like the things that character should obviously know, and so they make it into like this running gag of like, how do you not know that? How are you even on this ship and not know who the captain is? It's just like
the twist that leads to, and like, I don't want to spoil that, but the twist that leads to Knights of the Old Republic, I think at least, is really, really good.
Yeah,
but yeah, they didn't do the.
And that's why I wanted to throw. That's why I wanted the caveat in that I haven't actually finished the game, because that's what I have heard is that the way that they actually reveal how amnesia works is actually pretty good. So I don't want to speak preemptively on that. But even just the fact that the device is used so often, and in the way that I'm describing, the way that Landon is described, as either a means to withhold information without like really strong reason to do so, other than just to keep the mystery going longer, or as a way to just inform the player about things that the character should know but the player does not, is where it tends to be grating. So I really like both of the examples that you brought up, Sam, Final Fantasy VII and Lost Odyssey. We'll talk about Lost Odyssey first, because the idea is so novel. Yeah, I've never seen any other story explore it quite like that. Where, I mean, let's take even something like, because you have immortal beings in a lot of other stories, like say Tolkien's mythology, but these elves remember very, very well all of these things that happened thousands and thousands of years ago. They recall being there and seeing the Dark Lord as he descended. I was there. They like perfectly remember everything that happened. And Lost Odyssey goes in the total opposite direction of that. He's just been alive so freaking long that he just does not remember these things clearly. And then being able to sort of like recall those things in the dream sequences in such beautifully written passages was just an absolute joy. Just like my absolute favorite thing about that game, because I had never seen that done before.
I actually have they published all those short stories in a book, and it's in Japanese. I don't know how to read Japanese, but there was a point where we were in San Francisco, and I found it in a bookstore, and I'm like, yes, this is mine. Because you're right, they are. I guess this is kind of a sidetrack. I just love this game too much, but like, they are. It explored immortality in a way too that like I hadn't really seen. Like the very first story you unlock is about him talking to a little girl that he's known and who is dying of a disease, and there's this exchange where she's all like, "It's okay, like I'll see you later in the afterlife," and he's like, and like thinking to himself like, I won't, like I won't be able to do that, and like it's such that among so many other stories are like such heartbreaking things, and like the amnesia is something that allows us to experience those elements of this person's life in the way we do, and like it's
the first time ever.
Play it. It's good.
Yes, you should. It's the first time ever that an immortal being has felt relatable to me. Mm-hmm. Because if you were to just take a human life and just extend it for thousands of years with all our brains working the same way, that's exactly what would happen. Yeah. You would forget so many things that happen, and the longer that goes, you'd forget people entirely that you knew and associated with for many, many years. Let's just pretend that I go on to live for 7,000 years after this date, and all of you pass away in a normal lifespan. How much of my relationship with any of you would I even remember at that point after that many years? I mean, it's really hard to say. And that question was explored just in such a cool way in Lost Odyssey.
Dude, I don't remember, like, who was my best friend when I was 7? I don't even remember.
Yeah, I know. That was just like
first grade class or second or third.
It's exactly true.
I know like 3 people maybe.
And that's actually a good point.
Yeah, no, it did. I think they did actually. I think they did.
You've seen that, right?
I vaguely remember the name. I don't think I've actually seen it though. Do they explore that in that as well? Oh crap, we just lost him again.
Oh no.
Anyways. So, okay, I'll just wait to see if they are saying something.
Sorry, we didn't hear you.
Oh, okay. Tuck Everlasting. I haven't seen it. I've heard of the movie, but is it they explore a similar idea?
I watched it in school. Yeah, it's basically like a family that it's a little spoiler, but it's like a family that ran across the Fountain of Youth.
Yeah.
It was rumored to be like in Florida or something like that.
Oh gosh, I can't remember.
Anyway, they had run across it ages and ages ago to save someone from dying or something. And there's a whole family of, I believe, of people that were immortal or frozen at that age or whatever. But I can't remember if they forgot things or not. But the Lost Odyssey, that whole thing reminds me of Tuck Everlasting. It's just on the same time scale, thousands of years.
Yeah.
I'll have to watch it then, because I think the idea is just so awesome. I'd love to see it explored in more things. But another thing for me with Amnesia is the fact that it's so often used in a way where that's just clearly not the way retrograde amnesia works. You don't just fall over and hit your head and forget everything up until the time you hit your head. If your memories are being affected that far back, it generally will affect things like your ability to walk, your ability to speak.
Yeah.
It really messes you up in those kind of severe cases. It's not just I fell over and hit my head and I don't remember my name and I don't remember who my parents are or how I got here. That happens sometimes, but it is very, very rare. And so the fact that it happens so commonly in literature and in movies and stuff like that is, it does feel like a little bit lazy. Like nobody actually understands the science behind how retrograde amnesia actually works. Yeah. And so when a character is suffering from amnesia in that way, to me it always grates me a little bit. But coming back to Final Fantasy VII's example,
I was thinking that,
that is so much more believable for 2 reasons. One, he didn't just forget what happened. Okay. Spoilers if you haven't played Final Fantasy VII.
Yeah, lots of them.
But he doesn't just forget. It's just that it's mixed up. Yeah. He just doesn't have the details quite right. Like, not all the right pieces are in the right place. So that's one major difference. Yeah. But secondly, he was in like a vat of freaking Mako energy for months and months, it seems. And so like, it's not just like the common, oops, I bumped my head and I forgot who I was. It's like there's at least an in-world magical sort of explanation for it that feels a little bit better
Well, there's
especially
magic, but there's also just straight up PTSD, which Cloud
Sure.
clearly has. And
Right.
PTSD causes physical pain when recollecting certain memories, right?
Right.
And people will do whatever they can to not remember things that happened a long time ago because it is physically painful. And so by not thinking about that for enough time, you kind of, that memory kind of fades away. And it's like amnesia, but it's more like repressed memories as opposed to like
Right.
literally, amnesia happened. It's more like he forced those memories away or kind of mixed them up so that they made sense to him.
Yeah, and when done in that way, it doesn't feel like they're just creating the device for the purpose of withholding this information for later to be revealed. It's like
Yeah,
it's
it
a
didn't feel that
part
way at all.
of that drama. It's like it's
Yeah.
totally enmeshed in like it's not just like I'm going to save the twist for later so the character can't know what happened. It's like as
Yeah.
a result of what happened, the character became this way.
Yeah.
And it flows and makes perfect sense.
And it
in
helps
that-
too
in that way.
with the kind of thing I was talking about earlier about like Final Fantasy VII is at its core a game about like the legacy of those who leave us and like the
Oh, right.
both the pain and the like the acceptance, the whole process of dealing with that. And when we find out about that whole thing with Cloud, like that is that. It's what that is. Like everything in Final Fantasy VII is about that. So it works in with what the game is trying to say very, very well.
Yeah, it's very
absolutely,
much
yeah.
thematically enmeshed into everything.
Yeah.
I love it for that
And
reason.
specifically the way the live stream interacts with individuals and then with the planet as a whole, because you've got the individual Cloud who has issues remembering what happened in his past. Then you have the whole planet, which is like, okay, some calamity Genova came one day and just like screwed everything up, but we don't really know what happened. Like there's a collective amnesia of the whole planet as well. That's like there's some weird artifact and we don't really know why it's here, where it came from. And then Cloud.
No,
Oh no, Cloud does a thing.
Cloud, what happened? Cliffhanger.
Yep.
Find out next week
Come
on
back
the
next
podcast.
time for the thrilling conclusion. The Cloud will do one thing or another.
Specifically. And
We
the
lost
you.
live stream.
We
deals
lost
with
you
both
there.
of them.
Last year.
Oh, did you lose me?
What was last year?
Yeah.
It was the word cloud.
Yeah, Cloud was.
I can't remember what the
Did you get any of that
context
stuff?
is.
You were talking
Just-
about the live stream and the planet's kind of collective amnesia, and then started talking about Cloud. And
A
then you-
cloud, and then
Yeah, there you
yeah.
go. So Cloud has his personal amnesia. So I guess the point I was making was that Genova represents the planet's amnesia and the planet's like issues with dealing with a painful memory from the past, whereas Sephiroth represents Cloud's amnesia and his issue of dealing with his own past, which he had kind of forgotten and screwed up. And in both senses, like I always thought Genova was a weird like thing in Final Fantasy VII. I didn't get how it worked because it wasn't, Sephiroth is the final boss, but Genova was this way more powerful than Sephiroth, this massive thing from way back in the day. But it represents different things, and the way the live stream deals with it within the planet and then within Cloud himself, and specifically through Aeris, I suppose, is just really interesting to see, and it's clearly what the game is actually like about, right?
It is such a as convoluted and ridiculous a story as Final Fantasy VII has on a lot of levels. It is surprisingly thematically cohesive, and like once you. I'm gonna analyze this game sometime, so I'm probably spoiling my analysis a little bit or whatever. But like once you understand, I forget his name, but the guy who wrote Final Fantasy VI and VII and more of them,
Kitase, yeah.
Kitase, yeah.
Oh no! He's not the writer. Kazushige Nojima. That's the one.
Oh, no,
Okay, yeah. His mother died during the production of Final Fantasy VI, and like when you look at the story of Final Fantasy VII about not only just dealing with death, but literally like the world of Gaia and the live stream and stuff is something that like literally allows the legacy of the people you loved to continue on and continue to impact what's happening and stuff. Like the game just comes together so well on that level once you can parse through, everything that happens in that crazy 60-hour fantasy epic of insanity. It's real good. And yeah, just the amnesia relates to that in a big way. And it works well.
The craziest thing with 7 is that you don't know amnesia plays any part in anything. Like, as
Right.
far as you know, Cloud's like, oh, I know what happened before. I was in Soldier. I grew up with Tifa.
Yeah.
I did all
Yes,
these things.
good point. Good
And
point.
that was really surprising. Whereas most games don't do it that way. It's like Lost Odyssey, right from the get-go. This guy like almost monologue style. Like I don't know I don't remember anything. And then like Kingdom Hearts, all of a sudden in Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2, but it's like, how did I get here? Or like Kingdom Hearts 2 with Roxas. It's just like,
Final Fantasy
happening?
6, Final Fantasy 5, same way. Like Terra
Totally,
does
yeah.
not know
Yeah.
who she is right from
That's
the
true.
get-go.
So the
Galuf
one-
has no idea who he is right from the get-go, and they say that out loud. And
Exactly,
Cloud
and
doesn't
that's
realize it.
useful
That's a good
Yeah.
point.
for like the character, right? As you're playing the game, because when you're playing a game for the first time, you don't know what's going on either, right? And you made some funny joke about like the Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, and that's totally when it's used poorly, right? But it does parallel the player's experience by having the character they're controlling also not really know what's going on. But it's lazy because every game ends up doing that, and it's just lazy. But the Final Fantasies that do it well, really well, I think, specifically like Final Fantasy IX with Freya and Sir Fratley, that whole portion of the game is like almost Shakespearean, just the way that whole like the
tragic
A lot of Shakespeare.
side of it, yeah.
Totally. And then his name's Sir Fratley. I mean, how more like, I don't know, UK can you get here? But the way it's used there is tragic. It's a tragedy. It's not so much a utility. It's not lazy writing. It's not a way to move. It's not a plot device. It's just a tragic thing that happened, and that's Freya's just got to kind of learn to deal with it,
Yeah.
and that is. I don't know. It was done more like a Shakespearean way, and Shakespeare wrote tragedies, and that kind of, just.
Darn.
It hasn't been that long, has it? That's not.
I didn't think it had. I think it's getting worse as time goes on.
This is when like Jeff Goldblum turns to the camera. He's like, it's a countdown.
Yeah.
shorter interval.
It's totally backwards.
They lost you.
Oh,
We
did
lost
you
you
again?
Yeah.
Are you serious?
It's happening more frequently, it seems.
I think I was just repeating myself, but yeah, Final Fantasy 7 does it. You heard my thing about Final Fantasy 9 though, with Sir Fratley.
Yeah,
Yes.
with Sir Fratley,
Shakespeare and all
yeah.
that, and the tragic nature. So with Final
Yeah.
Fantasy 7, it's just so. I don't know how often tragedy or amnesia is done the way Final Fantasy 7 did it, but like that was just. I don't know. It was just really well done.
I love that point though. Is that the player, for all intents and purposes, had no idea that amnesia in any degree is in play for a long time. And that's like that's part of the plot twist, is like, oh, he doesn't actually remember what happened, but he was so sure of himself when he told the story the first
How
time.
many games
And that story was
do that?
so freaking engaging. It was so cool. It's like, oh, you can become attached to that scene almost immediately. It's like, wait a minute, that scene wasn't right. Well, what did happen? Like it's perfect the way that it's handled, in my opinion.
Yeah, which is a lot of why Crisis Core ended up being so. Like, honestly, I think in a lot of ways Crisis Core didn't tell its story as well as 7, but
No,
like
I totally agree with that.
it became very, very impacting because like we were already working off of that impact of. I mean, this is the opportunity to see the thing that had already just like through passing brief exposition, been really effective, and seeing it in more detail was great.
Yeah, that was the best scene of Crisis Core for sure. Was the
without question. If anything, this is a slight like tangent, but I think we're getting like near the end of this thing anyway. I think that if anything, the lazy use of amnesia is kind of getting replaced in modern day games by the lazy use of not Deus Ex Machina, of Medias Res
Deus Ex Machina
openings. Well, right. But so many games now are starting in medias res, where like it starts partway through the game, and then it's just like, now we're starting it, and like there's nothing wrong with that. Again, just like Amnesia, it works great. But I've seen so many games, like there was some mission in Modern Warfare 3 that did that, and you just did some things in this big attack, and then it was just like hours earlier, and like nothing, there was nothing big there. There was no reason, and Trails of Cold Steel, which I think is like one of the most it came out recently. It was one of the best JRPGs I've ever played. Not enough people have played it, but it did that too. It just started with something later, and like I get why in terms of having an exciting beginning, because the kid going to military school isn't that exciting, and having an interesting way to do the tutorial with a bunch of abilities and stuff instead of some games start you off with only one person in your party for most of the beginning, and that's boring. But like,
that's a good point.
On a story level,
Persona 5 did the same thing.
Yeah, that's right.
That's true.
Like halfway through. Yeah.
No, 5 at least did. Like it used that as a framing device, like throughout the course of the game. That's So like it can work. Like I'd say Persona 5 did it all right, but a lot of games I'm seeing now start doing that just to make the beginning more exciting instead of to actually be meaningful, and
to start off with an action scene rather than for a reason.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the new Amnesia, honestly.
Well, Final Fantasy 15's use of it.
Yeah, they did.
Yeah, that one was terrible too.
It's like,
That's actually a really good bad example
Whenever
of
I think
that.
about getting to 15, I'm like, oh, they're pushing the car along, but it's like, no. You're in the castle's burning, and you're running in with your friends, and everything's jacked. I'm like, oh yeah, that is how it started. That's
pushing
weird.
the car along was a great opening. Like I loved that. Like, what better way to capture the spirit of that game of just driving around with your bros? But yeah, the weird cut to later is just that's.
Yep.
It was
always
only like
forget
a
about
minute
that.
long too.
it's too short.
And like it taught you how to fight a little bit and how to like get your character up, and like it just was, it served no purpose. It was bad.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for thinking of that one. That was a great example.
It's a very good example. Okay, if there's nothing else, let's move on to our last topic here.
There's probably a lot more, but let's move on.
Charlie Rob asks how to effectively incorporate extra lore, backstory, and world building into a game or RPG. That's the topic. Again, using the Final Fantasy series as an example, Ultimania guides have been an extra source of information to help with the understanding of plot elements. But as disk space has increased more and more, information can be added directly into the games. 8 was the first with its information on people and places and events in the tutorial menu. 10 had the Wandering Scholar Howlin' Mad Machin. 12 had the clan primers, the bestiary, of which added an extra page of unrelated lore when you killed a certain number of each enemy. And 13 just went completely overboard, cramming all its story into a constantly updating data log. Of course, even with these in-game sources, they still make use of Ultimanias, as did other games. Which of these is the best system, if any? And then he edits, I personally really like the way lore was added into game manuals back in the day.
That last bit is such a mixed thing for me because I like the way that manuals had lore, but at the same time, a lot of older games, you'd have this thing where if you... like I tried to play Ultima 4 recently because that's a classic. And aside... Like, honestly, the main reason I couldn't actually do it was because the control system was so archaic and, like, every single friggin' button on the keyboard did a different thing, and it was just very confusing. But I'd like to still. But I also just didn't understand, like, the context or anything because it just drops you into the world, and the manual has all of the story. You get no information otherwise. And that continued for a long time. Even the first Halo game just starts off with, a ship looking at a ring, and you're like, wait, what? And the manual is what explains like that they just came from the massacre at Reach and stuff. And so I like the idea of lore being in there, but there are so many games that depended on that for the entire story early on. So like, I'm glad we're moving past it, but yeah, we definitely are struggling to find exactly how to make that work best.
Yeah, and I actually agree with you on that because I remember, I didn't play Final Fantasy 1 back in the early 90s. I played it for the first time, I want to say maybe like 9 or 10 years ago or something like that. I played the original NES version of it too. I didn't play I had played Dawn of Souls first, but the first time I played the NES version of it was when I started doing my Final Fantasy reviews, basically. And I remember in the first version of the video that I think this might have actually carried over into the latest version that's live on the channel now. But I talked about how they give you some vague explanation of where to go. They give you like a name of a place. But you pull up the map, there's no place names on the map. And it's like, well, how do I know where that place is? You told me what the name is. You told me the vague direction. It's east somewhere, but like there's like a billion dots on this map. Like which one of them is it? But all of that information was inside of the game manual. So, I think that they relied heavily on game manuals, especially for games like Ultima or Final Fantasy, those really old RPGs, because of the text limitations in the game. Like, they just could not, they didn't have the space to include the text that would be necessary to give all that context that you're looking for. So I understand it for that reason, but yeah, I don't necessarily like it when they do that because, I mean, I got the NES version of Final Fantasy, but it didn't come with a game manual. It just was the cart that I bought from a used game store. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So when you're buying a game used 20 years, 30 years down the line, and it doesn't come with a game manual, you're going to be missing a ton of stuff that you need to know about the game. Of course, we have the internet now. You can look it up that way too. But
Yeah.
when it comes to Ultimania guides, okay, I guess I would rather have it. A lot of people complain about the data log in Final Fantasy 13, where they just cram tons of world information that you, in some cases, really need to know. I think it's badly utilized there because they just used it as a crutch to not give context in the scenes.
Exactly.
And that's why that's bad. But I still prefer a data log, like let's say in Mass Effect's case, which did it really well, to having to buy a separate book outside of the game to understand it. I think Mass Effect handled it extraordinarily well because you could play Mass Effect and finish it and be like, I get it. But you could dive into the logs and get even deeper and a more enriching experience when you understood all of the context that's there. But it's not necessary to know. So it's easy to mess that up if you don't provide the context you need and you just put it into a paragraph for someone to read a billion different sections of just paragraph or two. That's one thing. That's not good, obviously, but I still prefer that to I have to go buy Japanese Ultimania and have someone translate it for me so I can freaking understand what the crap happened in the last 10 minutes of this game.
You actually hit two of the three examples I was going to bring up because, the Final Fantasy 13 is a great example of how to do it wrong just because, like, I honestly, I overall liked Final Fantasy 13, like more than a lot of people did. I will defend some elements of it, but I specifically liked like some of the character interactions and how their motivations, twisted together and stuff. The story, I have no freaking clue what happened, like in terms of the overall story of Final Fantasy 13, because I would have had to read all of that stuff to have any idea. They didn't explain like any. They just were throwing around terms like lassie and stuff, and if you didn't read everything, you'd have no idea what was going on. And even then, I'm not sure how much sense it made. But yeah, you're right that Mass Effect did it perfectly. You can go through Mass Effect without looking at any of the codex, understand it just fine, and if you're interested in more, you can look at the codex. And I think that the Elder Scrolls series is another decent example because it doesn't, at least as far as I recall, it doesn't, like Skyrim doesn't have a codex in it or anything, like it doesn't have a database, but you can ask questions. Like when you're talking to people, you can either just, they'll just tell you like, oh, there's this thing going on, go deal with it, and you can be like, okay, or you can ask them for more information. What is this? Why is it happening? Like what's going on? And you can go through the game perfectly fine and understand it without asking more of those questions, but they're always there for you to ask. And with the books to read and stuff like that, there's a lot of, like, basically I think that one way or another, the ideal way to do it is to give enough information through the basic story that it's fine, and then give all the other information in one or another optional way.
Yeah. I think games, with all the books and the scrolls in Skyrim in particular, but just in the Elder Scrolls, I think are really good examples of that. I remember when Landon downloaded, it was that PDF that you had on your tablet that had like all the books in Skyrim like compiled, and you were just sort of reading through some of that. Yeah. And I remember you were like, holy crap, like, and you were reading this thing, and I was like, whoa, like, just lore that like I had no idea about, but just totally like changed my view of the world of the Elder Scrolls, and like, man, like that's really cool, and like knowing that like changes this, and we've talked about this a little bit in the past with like say Tolkien's Middle Earth and like Lord of the Rings, and then having read the Silmarillion, then going back and reading Lord of the Rings again. It's like it's perfectly fine standalone thing, but when you have this context, it just makes it so much deeper. That's when you know you've done it right.
I think, so just talking about systems and how video games are incorporating these systems, I really like the way the books work in Elder Scrolls games. What I don't like is that it's really hard to find all of them, for one. But for another, they're often very, very short, right? By nature, they're a 4 or 5 page excerpt, and so you very quickly forget the context because there's a series of them, and they're meant to be read in a certain order, and you very rarely find them in that order. And so it's almost kind of while it enriches the world on one hand and makes you curious about things, on the other hand, there's not a real good mechanism for just building a library.
Sure.
So you can read through it yourself, which is why I had to go, and somebody had compiled everything into an ebook that I ended up reading, and it was like that's what I wanted, but I couldn't do that in the game, and I like the approach with it being a real world object that you interact with, not just some piece of metadata. You know what I mean? Like it's actually a thing you found that has information in it. But I wish there was a way that you could collect it. Or I ended up installing a mod that showed me which books I had and hadn't read already. Because it's one of the worst aspects of Skyrim specifically is gameplay. You just you get in a room with a ton of books. You just like open, close, open, close, open, close, open, close. One might not. And it's just super. I don't know. It's broken. I think
because you're just looking for the one that'll give you the stat boost. Yeah. Anyways,
just like the stat boost is there to incentivize you to read the books, but all you do, it kind of worked. The way it's actually used is to flip the system on its head. It's like you have no incentive to read the books. You're just opening them all.
And that's maybe a little quiz at the end. You get the stat boost.
Exactly. That would be pretty deep. But that's another problem with Skyrim is just opening urns. There's one piece of gold inside. Close that urn. Right. Open this urn.
Yeah.
There's some tedious things that need to be worked on there a little bit. But I love the fact that it being a real world object.
Right. That it exists.
You found an object with information.
I agree with that because there's two ways to look at this question. When I first read it, I was thinking more in terms of like what is mentioned by Chocolate Rock, by the Ultimanias, the book manuals for the games and stuff. And I'm thinking, no, I'd rather have everything in the game. But you're bringing up Skyrim with all the books, and I can't remember who else had mentioned like in-game stuff. Mm-hmm. Like the Final Fantasy 13, how it's kind of just like in your data log, and you just kind of look it up. I think it's really cool when the video games are unique, right, from films and books. In a book, someone has to tell you the history of the world. Someone has to tell it to you. You can't go find out yourself. In a movie, it has to be spoken. It has to be shown in a film because you're not going to know it otherwise. But in a game,
in the flow of the greater.
Exactly. But you're in this world, or you have to get it on outside things. Like Mike mentioned the Silmarillion. Tolkien wasn't going to include all that in one book, but it's cool that he wrote things where you can go to and find that. But what would be cooler is if The Lord of the Rings was a game and you could go around and just find out what happened in Middle-earth on your own outside of the linear story that's being told, right? Now, I'm not suggesting to replace it with a game or anything, or that it would have been better as a game, but it would have been cooler in some regards. In Skyrim, where it's like, they're taking advantage of the fact that they're a game, and you're in this world. Go find out what happened. Go learn your history. Like, I live on planet Earth, and I don't know a lot of history, and I have to go read books and find out what happened in my own country that I live in. And, oh, wow, I find interesting stuff out all the time. Like, having a game incorporate that real-life utility into it is awesome, and is super valuable.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. See, this is gonna make everyone hate me a little bit, but I might even actually make that argument that you said you weren't making, that Lord of the Rings would have been better as a game for that reason, just because I so very much respect, like, the world of Middle-earth that Tolkien made. I cannot stand the way, like, I couldn't make it through the trilogy, specifically because I hated the way he used exposition. Like, I want to find out about Middle-earth. I don't want to spend 2 chapters in this weird dude's treehouse just having him spout information out.
That is where everyone stops reading the Fellowship of the Ring.
See, I made it through, but I'm not going to lie, I skipped a bunch. And then it was sometime in Return of the King when, like, Gandalf was taking Pippin to Minas Tirith and was, like, explaining the history of random stuff they passed, that I was like, okay.
I love that. Yeah.
Yeah, I just, like, for me, I want it to matter. Like, I always point to Dune as the example of a book that I felt did it right, because, like, when they explained stuff, it was because they came across it, because it was important in that moment, and we had to learn about it, not just because it was around and, they wanted to talk about it. And, like, I love that about, like, I honestly probably would have enjoyed the story of Lord of the Rings more if that lore was something that I could, like, explore and find, than when it was something that was being told to me when I wanted to know what happened next.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and I think that's a theoretical strength of games.
Yeah, exactly. Because in a game, what is necessary for you, the character, to know is, I mean, some of it's not up to you, but a lot of it is up to you. Do you want to go and talk to everyone in town? Do you want to go and read all the books? that's in your hands. And if you're a person who cares to do it, go ahead. But if, like you mentioned with Dune only giving you the important stuff, sweet. If that's, go do that. But it's nice to be able to dictate the pace of your own story.
Yeah. Which was a big problem, maybe a slight sidetrack, but with Elder Scrolls Online, like I enjoyed a little bit of what I played with that, fine, but I was playing with a friend who would get a quest and then go do it. So he'd be like halfway done with the quest, and I'm still asking this guy why it's happening and what's good. Like there were so many other dialogue options, and I wanted to know everything. And by the time I was done talking,
like
he'd be killing the boss or whatever. And
and he's already did it. This is funny because something else that was mentioned here earlier, and we brought up Final Fantasy 15 before. I was actually showing, I was talking about Final Fantasy 15 Pocket Edition to someone I work with, and that person I showed him Pocket Edition first, and I was like, it turns out he hadn't actually seen Final Fantasy 15, the original game. So I was like, oh, dude, okay, well, and then I showed him Final Fantasy 15, and he was like, oh my gosh, you fight some huge things in that game. I think he saw the Adamant twice for like a scene or two. And he was like, oh man, dude, the boss of this game looks cool. And I'm like, that's not the boss. But okay, I hear you. Because he's looking at the summons and just seeing how big and he wanted to play it because of that. And then he said the most interesting thing to me that for some reason it never really crossed my mind, at least not for 15 years probably. But he said, man, the final boss in this game's got to be cool. And then he looks at me and he goes, because that's why people play these games, is for the final boss, right? And I was like, whoa, this is in a different world than I'm in. And the four of us are in as far as video games go. Why do you play video games? To fight the final boss because he's going to be so tall? Like, hey, dude, this is weird. That game's just weird. And I'm like, hey, the final boss of this game's like some other dude. Like, it's not even like these big summons that they're showing in the trailer. Yeah. But it's really funny. It's just a weird way of thinking. But when you look at it this way, it's like some people play Final Fantasy just to fight the boss at the end.
Do you remember playing Super Mario RPG and talking about what is Smithy?
Yeah, dude, we didn't know. He was that sword.
Yeah. We want to find out what Smithy actually is.
Yeah.
We want to get to the final boss because we want to know more about Smithy, right?
True.
I remember that. At least
that was
that game being like
20 years ago. Yeah, that's true. I have played games to get to the final boss before, especially when I was younger, but that's just not something
But even in that example, you wanted to get there to learn what Smithy was, not because you couldn't wait to fight the final boss. Right? It was like you're interested in pursuing like the mystery of what the character is. Which is
it was really mysterious,
Yeah. It's
For a
worth
Mario
noting
game,
too
that
that
was unprecedented, by the way.
Yeah, and it's worth noting too that there are some games that like don't have a final boss and like are better for it, or some games for that matter, like BioShock. If you took the final boss out of BioShock, it would have been so much better. Like, that just happens. Like, we are kind of moving past the idea, thankfully, of like needing to have a big fight at the end in order to make the ending work. But that was a thing for a long time. So I guess I can see where the guy's coming from. That
I'll tell you what, one of the most memorable experiences I've ever had with what is supposed to be a final boss but ends up not being. They kind of just didn't throw in a final boss. And a lot of people disagree with me on this. That's fine. But at the end of Fable 2, you walk in and the guy who's the villain of the story starts monologuing. And I literally just took my gun out, just shot him in the middle of his monologue. I was like, I'm not even listening to you. And to this day, like that was...
Your dog.
Yeah, I was just pissed. I was like, I'm gonna let this guy talk to me. Like, I'm not gonna let him even have a chance to describe why he did what he did. I hate you and I'm killing you now. And to this day, like, that's more memorable than, say, Necron in Final Fantasy IX or any kind of like 5th level god final boss. To this day, that interaction where I had the choice to interrupt a villain during his monologue and just shoot him in the face, like that stood out way more to me.
Especially after he killed your dog. And you're just like, screw you.
Yeah.
So
I like that way better.
A lot of people took issue with that just because if you do listen to his monologue, eventually Reaver shoots him instead. Yeah. And that's super anticlimactic, but that's because Reaver is a jerk, and I still hate Fable 3 for not letting me murder him. But
but yeah, I totally agree with that. But I don't know. There's a lot of bad ways to put your lore into your game or story or whatever. Go ahead.
Well, there was one other thing that was on my mind too, just that there are some cases where you can try something completely different, and it's more risky, but it works. And I think that we can look to some of Supergiant's games, like as an example of how that might work. Like Pyre, their most recent one, does an interesting thing where whenever a word that's part of the lore or that's the name of a character comes up, you can like hover over it, and it gives like a brief explanation of what it is, so that you can just kind of always have access to that. And then you have other things like their previous game, Transistor, where you very intentionally don't know all that much. Like, they don't explain much of the world. They talk about the people that inhabit it, and you see it being consumed by this process. And even by the end of the game, there are a lot of questions about what it all means. And your mileage may vary on that, but like it's a different but legit, like, it's not bad world building. It's very intentional world, like one way or another, whether it turns out good or bad, it's what they were trying to do.
Sure.
And so, like, I guess it just seemed worth noting to me that, like, sometimes you can try something completely different from trying to give all of the world's information and build it up completely.
Yeah.
It's more risky, but in the right situation, it might work.
Yeah. Really depends contextually on what you're doing.
Yeah, because okay, we were talking about game manuals a little bit earlier about how those would include information or whatever. And to be honest, video game manuals, like, I don't know how closely the developers collaborated with, like, who was putting the manuals
Some of them
together.
are weird.
But, well, sometimes they tell you crap that you would think you should just want to find out in the game. Like in Super Metroid's manual, they basically tell you what all the bosses are, like, in the game.
That's true. Yeah, they do.
Yeah.
And it's like,
and in Mario RPG, you see
why?
all the characters.
Right, yeah. Like,
And you're not supposed to know.
so they're almost too upfront with, like, the lore, so to speak, as to whatever extent you can consider that to be lore.
Yeah.
But they're telling you crap way earlier than you really should know it. Although I don't know, maybe someone wants to know what all the bosses are before they play it and know all the strategies, like all the weak points from the bosses in the manual. Like, I don't know. But there was a different philosophy. You wouldn't see that nowadays. No one would do that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know, because you don't know if someone's going to read the manual before they play the game.
Yeah.
Or like in the middle of the game or after they were done playing the game. I always read them before I played the game, because we can only play so many hours a day.
Yeah.
I'd like be sitting in the car while my mom's driving home and just like open up the manual because I was so excited to play or whatever.
Yeah.
I think there's something you said, because I've seen things like that recently, but not in the manuals, in the art books that come with like special editions or whatever.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Like, I got the special edition of Final Fantasy Type 0, and it's got like info on all of, each of the main characters and stuff in there. Or heck, the Trails of Cold Steel one, straight up, like, it was for both the first and second game, and partway through it was just like, hey, spoilers for the ending of the first one from here on, like, don't read it till later. And that kind of content is interesting, but yeah, I think less as preparatory for the game, because it just kind of ruins stuff, more as kind of a collector's, like, a cool book about the game you played. Yeah. So I like that approach for it, because I think you're right, including too much info right in that can kind of mess up the experience.
Yeah. Right.
Well, awesome. We've reached the end of our topics for the day.
You sure there's not one more question?
Some other big long one.
Really, really good conversation though. This one really well. Really good questions from the audience too. So thanks for asking, everybody.
Yeah, good job.
Wow, what a great audience!
What a great audience. Thank you so much, Sam, for coming on. It was great to have you.
Yeah,
anybody who wants to see his channel, it's Games as Literature. There will be a link at the top of the description. Go and watch his stuff. It's really awesome. And subscribe. Really great channel. And if you'd like to come on again, we'd love to have you back, because the conversation was awesome. So.
Oh, yeah, happily.
Okay. If you're listening to this, audio only, go to YouTube, and then go to Games as Literature, but then also go to Dark Pixel Gaming. That's where you can find our gaming analysis. And thanks for listening. We'll see you again next week. Peace out.
Later.